A little before dawn, in the summer of 430 BC, the road that comes into Athens through the Dippolon Gate is already busy, and almost everything moving on it is arriving rather than leaving. Donkeys under load. A boy driving 4 goats that have nowhere in this city to graze. Dust lifting off the surface as they pass, because the road is not paved and it has not rained since spring. The street climbs from the gate toward the middle of the city, and along the colonnade at the top of it, there are men asleep on the stone, rolled in their cloaks with their sandals still on. They are not beggars. They are farmers, and they have been sleeping here or somewhere very like here since the spring of last year. Their land is a few hours' walk to the north, and for the second summer running, they cannot go to it. Behind them, in the east, the sky is going pale over the mountain the city takes its honey from, and above them, up on the rock, stands a temple whose scaffolding came down 2 years ago. It is painted red and blue in the places where the carving is. The world has not stopped looking at it since. This is the second summer of a war. Last year, an army came down out of the Peloponnese into the farmland around the city, and this year it came again and stayed longer. Something close to 40 days of cutting and burning, unopposed. Nobody went out to meet it. That was a decision, and it had been taken deliberately, in the open, by a show of raised arms. Athens in this year is the richest city in the Greek world, and the money arrives by sea. More than 100 cities around the Aegean pay it a yearly sum, and the silver is kept up on the rock behind the new temple's doors. 200 warships went out of the harbour last summer, each one carrying something like 170 rowers, and the rowers were paid, and they were free men. What the city will not do is fight a Spartan army in a field, because it would lose. So it sits behind its walls instead, holds the 4 miles of walled road down to the sea, and eats off its ships for as long as this takes. Which means that everyone living outside those walls has to come inside them. And they did. They brought their families and their tools and their household gods. They shipped the sheep and the cattle across to Euboea and the islands, and according to a man who was in the city while it was happening, they pulled the woodwork out of their own country houses, the doors, the frames, the roof timbers, and carried that in as well, because they were not confident there would be a house to come back to. His name was Thucydides. He was an Athenian of about 40 from a family with money and mining interests up in Thrace, and a few years after this summer he would be sent out to defend a city, fail to reach it in time, and be exiled for it. He spent the rest of his life setting down what he had seen. He is unusual among the writers who survive from the ancient world in one particular respect, and it is the reason we keep coming back to him. When he does not know a thing, he says so. So if you were standing on that road at first light, with the dust coming up and the donkeys going past, what you would be looking at is not quite a city. It is a city with a whole countryside crammed inside it. Every open piece of ground is occupied. The gaps between the houses have shelters wedged into them, some of them no more than cloth over a frame. Families are living in the sanctuaries, sleeping among the dedications that other families left there generations ago, and the towers along the wall have been taken over and turned into rooms. The noise, though, is the ordinary noise of any city getting up. A door, a bucket, a cart with a bad axle. Somebody coughing, somebody else complaining about the hour. That part has not changed and probably never will. What has changed is all of the arrangement underneath it, because the men lying along that colonnade have not lost their standing along with their fields. They are citizens. In a few days, some of them will walk up a low hill on the west side of the city and vote by lifting an arm on whether to keep doing this. And one or two of them, at some point before they die, will be picked out by lottery to hold the seal of the city and the keys to its treasury. For one day, none of it can reach you. The Dippelon Gate is a set of foundations inside a fenced archaeological site now, with a gravel path around it and a sign explaining what you are looking at. The road runs on for a few dozen yards and then stops. The men asleep along the colonnade have been gone for 2,456 years. And so has the colonnade. And so is the army they were hiding from. You are warm wherever you are, and it is now, and this morning finished a very long time ago. We cannot do anything for these people. There is no version of this in which we get to. What is left to us is a smaller and much slower thing. To go back into an hour like this one carefully, and get the details right and not invent the parts that did not survive. It is not much, but it turns out to be enough to be going on with. But before we go up that road, one small thing. If you find yourself drawn to this kind of slow reading of the record, a real city, walked at its own pace, an hour at a time, consider subscribing, and we can keep going back into these mornings together. There are a great many of them still to open, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, your city and your time zone. This particular morning is 2,500 years old, and it is a good thing to find out how far it still carries. Now let us begin indoors in the last hour of the dark, in a house that is holding more people than it was ever built to hold. The first decision of the day in an Athenian house is whether to light anything at all. The lamp is a small closed dish of fired clay, with a hole in the top for filling and a spout at one end to hold the wick, and the whole object sits comfortably in a cupped hand. Fill it with olive oil, and it will burn for something in the region of 4 hours. Modern reconstructions run a little longer in cold air and a little shorter in warm. And what it gives back is a low, golden light, almost without smoke, enough to see a face across a small room, and not really enough to work by. An Athenian evening is therefore exactly as long as the oil somebody is willing to spend on it. And oil is money. At this hour, then, nobody lights anything. Dawn is coming on its own and costs nothing, and the household moves about in the dark by memory instead, which is less difficult than it sounds in a house of this size. A house here is built out of the ground it stands on. A course or two of rough stone at the bottom to keep damp from climbing the walls, and above that mud brick, clay and chopped straw, pressed into moulds and dried in the sun, never fired. Timber for the roof beams, terracotta tiles laid over them, or in a poorer house a flat roof of reed and packed clay that has to be rolled smooth again after heavy rain. The floors are beaten earth. In a wealthy house, one room might have a floor of set pebbles, and that room will be the one guests are shown into. From the street, the house is a wall. There is a door in it, and possibly a small window set high up, and that is the whole of what the street is offered. Everything the building has to say, it says inward, into a courtyard, with the rooms opening off that rather than off the road. The fire is in there as well, and there is no chimney above it, so the smoke leaves through the doorway and the gaps in the tiles, and, to a considerable extent, through the people. That fire is also where the household's gods are understood to live, which is worth holding on to, because a great deal of what happens to a person in this world, being accepted into a family, being married into one, happens by walking around it. Because the walls are dried mud, they can be dug through. And they were, often enough that the ordinary Greek word for a burglar means, quite literally, a wall digger. Not a man who picks a lock or forces a door, but one who takes the quiet option and goes in through the side of the house. It is a small piece of vocabulary doing more work than a paragraph of description could. And it explains why a good door was such a serious possession. We know what was in these rooms with a precision that has very little to do with luck. In 414 BC, 16 years after the morning we are standing in, Athens convicted a group of prominent men of a religious offence, confiscated everything they owned down to the contents of their kitchens, sold the lot at public auction, and then had the results carved into stone and set up in the middle of the city, where anybody who could read was welcome to go and read them. The stones are broken now, and what survives is fragmentary, and the fragments are remarkable anyway. Bronze pots, tables and couches, tools, doors, listed and priced as items in their own right, because a door was a substantial thing that could be lifted off its pivot and carried off. Standing crops in named places, the crop at Thria, the crop at Parthenon, sold where they grew, and people entered in the same columns and priced by the same clerk. Two honest caveats belong out loud rather than tucked away. These were rich men's households, considerably better furnished than most, and the list was cut a decade and a half after our summer. But it is the nearest thing that exists to an inventory of an Athenian room, and what it describes is a way of living with very few objects in it. Not necessarily poverty, simply a small number of things, each one substantial enough to be worth writing down. Water has to be fetched, since nothing is piped into the house. Somebody walks to the nearest public fountain with a jar, a daughter, a household slave, a wife in a family with no slave to send. Waits her turn at the spout, fills it and carries it home on her shoulder or her head, because a full water jar is not something you carry in your arms. Then she goes back and does it again. In a corner of the courtyard, a loom stands upright against the wall, its threads held taut by rows of small, pierced clay weights. And those weights are among the commonest objects that come out of Athenian houses when anyone digs one up. The cloth on that frame is going to be somebody's clothing. It will take weeks. Into this house, at some point in the spring of the previous year, came other people. Relatives from the family's home village out in the countryside, most likely, with their children and their bedding and whatever tools they judged worth the walk. Those who had kin inside the walls went to them. It was by a wide margin the better outcome. You have probably been in a house that was holding more people than it was built for, a family crisis, a spare room that quietly became somebody's home for a season. And you will recognize the texture of it. Everyone becomes very slightly too polite. Small territories are established without discussion and defended without anyone admitting that is what they are doing. A cup goes missing and is not mentioned. Nobody is unkind, everybody is tired, and the first thing to disappear is not food or money, but the ordinary ability to be unobserved for an hour. Now hold that arrangement across a second summer with no agreed ending, in a climate where the afternoons are seriously hot, in a house that had no privacy in it to begin with. Most families arriving from the countryside had no relative in the city at all, and they took whatever ground was unclaimed, which by this year meant that almost nothing was. And there was one piece of ground below the Acropolis that had stayed empty for as long as anybody could remember, and had stayed empty deliberately. It was called the Pelagikon, and an old oracle had said, in the compressed and unhelpful manner of oracles, that the Pelagikon was better left idle. So it had been. Not built on, not planted, not slept in, kept clear by a city otherwise perfectly willing to pave over anything on the authority of a line of verse that nobody could date. In the second summer of the war, people moved onto it. What they said to one another while they did it is not in the record. Whether anyone objected, how long the argument ran before the first family set its bedding down on ground, everyone had grown up understanding was not to be used. None of that survives. What survives is the fact and the reason, which is that there was nowhere else. Afterwards, when things had gone very badly indeed for the city, people remembered the oracle and concluded it had been right all along. The forbidden ground had been occupied, and disaster had followed in that order as a punishment. Thucydides, who was inside the walls and watched the whole business, thought they had the sequence backwards. The trouble had not arrived because the ground was settled. The ground was settled because trouble had already arrived. It is a small piece of reasoning tucked into a very long book, and it is the sort of thing that makes him worth reading 24 centuries later. A man standing in the middle of a frightened city, quietly declining to accept the explanation everybody around him has agreed on. By that second summer, there was almost no ground left inside the walls of Athens without somebody's life set down on it. A shelter wedged into an alley. A family in the corner of a sanctuary, sleeping among other people's offerings. A workshop with cousins laid out across its floor. A wall tower with washing strung up inside it. A courtyard with goats in it that had never been meant to hold goats. The city had taken in its own countryside and had nowhere to set it down, and every one of those people still had to eat. The fish has been lying out since the middle of the morning, and by noon you can smell the market from 2 streets away. Nobody in the square appears to mind. The smell is simply the smell of the place at this hour, mixed into everything else. The smoke coming off the altars, which in this city is what cooked meat smells like. Charcoal under a dozen portable braziers, onions and garlic, wine turning slightly in the heat. The tanneries, which are supposed to be far enough out that this does not happen, and are not. And several thousand people who have walked here in a hot climate, and whose method of washing involves olive oil and a curved bronze scraper. Most of the market is not architecture. There are colonnades round the edges of the square, long roofed walkways with columns down one side. And that is where you stand when the sun becomes a genuine problem. But the selling happens out in the open, off trestle tables and wicker booths and awnings held up on poles, and all of it goes up in the morning and comes down again at the end of the day. If you came into the square looking for something particular, you would not ask anyone for a street. You would ask for the goods themselves, because the sections of the market are known by what is in them, and a man says he is going to the fish the way we might name a shop. An Athenian meal has 2 parts, and they are not courses. There is the part that fills you, and there is the part that makes the first part bearable. The filling half is barley for most people on most days, not the wheat loaf we tend to picture when we imagine ancient bread. Barley will not rise properly, so what it makes is dense and faintly sour, kneaded rather than baked into anything with a crust. And it is the floor of the diet. Wheat exists, costs more, and arrives largely by ship. Around that staple goes everything else, which is where the olives and the cheese and the raw onion and the salt fish live, and the fresh fish on a day when the boats have done well. You hold the bread in your left hand and take the other thing with your right, in small quantities, because there is never very much of it. All of the wanting in this system is in the right hand. Nobody has ever longed for barley, and the Athenians were sufficiently alert to what was going on there that a man who took too much of the good part with his bread was committing a recognizable fault. Not a joke about greed, but something closer to a defect of character. The kind of thing that could be raised against him in public by people who wanted him to look weak. Meat sits outside all of this, and the reason is worth being clear about. Almost every animal killed in Athens is killed for a god. The beast is led out, the barley grains are scattered, the throat is opened, the thigh bones and fat go up in smoke as the god's portion, and the rest is divided among the people standing there. So meat arrives on festival days in shares as part of a religious occasion, and it arrives free. What you cannot generally do is walk into the market with money and buy a joint of beef, because you feel like beef. Fish is not sacrificial, and never has been. Fish is simply bought at a price nobody controls, which rises when the weather has been bad and falls when it has not, and which the whole city watches, which makes the feeling in this square an entirely familiar one. It is the small daily arithmetic about whether today is a day for the good thing or the cheap thing, performed at exactly the moment you are hungriest and least sensible, in front of a man who wants you to buy the good thing. 2,500 years is a long time, and that particular negotiation has not moved an inch. The money it is conducted in is astonishingly small. An obol is well under a gram of silver, a thin disc narrower than a fingernail, and 6 of them make a drachma. Greek clothing, meanwhile, has no pockets and no fastenings to speak of. A chiton is a rectangle of wool pinned at the shoulders. A hymation is a larger rectangle you wrap around yourself and hold, so there is simply nowhere on a man's body to put a coin. The answer, universally, is the mouth. You keep your small change tucked between your cheek and your teeth, and you take it out when you need it. We do not have to guess at this because a comedy put on 8 years after this summer builds a joke on it and expects no explanation. An old man is owed his share of a purchase, and what gets pressed into his hand in the confusion is not coins at all, but 3 scales off a mullet. He does the automatic thing, which is to put them in his cheek for safekeeping. Then the taste arrives, and he spits them out across the stage. The gag only functions if several thousand people recognize the gesture instantly before the line has finished landing. Jokes are evidence. They tell you what a whole room could be relied upon to know without being told. A skilled man in Athens earns a drachma a day, and an unskilled man about 3 obols. Set that against something we are all fairly sure we understand, which is the pottery. The red and black painted vases that sit spotlit in glass cases in London and New York and Munich, described on the label as masterworks of the classical world, were stock. Traders scratched their working notes on the underside of the feet, and those notes survive in quantity, batch counts, abbreviations, prices. One of them records in effect 4 of these for 3.5 obols. The honest qualification is that these marks were made by merchants handling pots for export, so the figures are likely wholesale rather than what you would hand over at a stall. The order of magnitude is the point. These things moved by the dozen and the crate, and they were priced accordingly, and the men who painted them were tradesmen being paid by the piece. There is a pattern in that which we are still standing inside. The objects a society turns out in enormous quantity, and thinks so little of that a stranger scratches a price on the bottom in a hurry, are exactly the objects that survive in numbers. And surviving in numbers is what eventually makes them precious. Nothing about the pot has changed. We changed. All of this trade runs on silver, and silver can be counterfeited. Coins get plated over base metal, clipped at the edges, mixed in from cities whose standards nobody trusts. So at the tables where money physically changed hands, there sat a man whose entire function was to rule on it. You gave him the coin. He looked at it, weighed it, cut into it if he needed to, and if it was sound, he handed it straight back. If it was not, he cut it through and it went to the mother of the gods. Dedicated at her sanctuary, not confiscated, not melted down for anyone's profit. The city removed bad money from circulation by giving it to a goddess. The stone that lays out this arrangement was carved in 375 BC, 55 years after the morning we are standing in, and that gap has to be said rather than glossed over. What makes it usable is that the law itself refers in passing to a tester already at work in the city under an earlier statute, one that has not come down to us. So the office is older than the document describing it. Precisely how much older is not something anybody can put a date to. And then there is the man. He sat at the center of the commercial life of the richest city in the Greek world, with the authority to decide whether the silver in a stranger's hand was real, and his decision was final, and everybody in the square accepted it. He was also the property of the state. Not a poor man who had taken hard work for wages, but a person the city had bought, kept, and could dispose of. Once you have seen him, the square changes shape because he is not an exception in it. Some very large share of the people moving through the middle of Athens on this hot afternoon. The porters carrying, the woman waiting her turn at the fountain, the boy holding the awning pole steady while somebody ties it off, do not belong to themselves. Working out how large that share was and what it actually meant from 1 hour to the next is the hardest thing anyone has ever tried to do with this city. Somewhere in these years, an Athenian who disliked his own city sat down and wrote a short, sour, extremely intelligent pamphlet explaining how the democracy worked and why it was so difficult to dislodge. His name has not survived. The essay did, largely by accident. It ended up bound in with the collected works of Xenophon and travelled down the centuries under his name, which is why scholars refer to its author as the old oligarch, for want of anything better. He is not a fool, and he is not writing propaganda. He is doing something closer to grudging analysis. Here is why the poor run this place. Here is why the arrangement is stable. Here is why people like him are not going to win. And among the things that irritate him most, set out in a passage of about 4 sentences, is that he is not permitted to hit anyone in the street. Among the slaves and the resident foreigners at Athens, he complains, there is the most extraordinary license. You cannot strike them there. A slave will not even step out of your way. And then he explains the reason, which is the part worth slowing down for. If it were the custom for a free man to strike a slave, he says, you would constantly be hitting Athenian citizens by mistake, having taken them for slaves, because the common people of Athens are no better dressed than the slaves and the foreigners are, and no better looking. He means it as an insult to the poor. What he has actually done is record something that a modern listener will find very hard to hold in the mind, which is that in the streets of Athens you could not tell. There was no branding, no collar, no shaved head, no distinguishing dress, no badge, nothing worn or marked that separated an enslaved person from a citizen going about his mourning. The line existed, and it was absolute, and it was also invisible at 10 paces. A man carrying a basket through the market might be a citizen doing his own shopping, a foreigner working for wages or property. Nothing about the basket, the tunic, or the walk would tell you. And the old oligarch's complaint is that this had consequences for people like him, that he had to be careful because getting it wrong was expensive. How many people this applied to is a question nobody can answer, and the honesty of the answer matters more than the number. Athens never counted its slaves because there was no administrative reason to. The estimates historians work with come from indirect evidence, mining leases, army musters, grain imports, and ancient writers with their own reasons to inflate or minimize. And they land somewhere between 80,000 and 150,000 across Attica, against a total population of perhaps 300,000 to 350,000. That is a range so wide it is really an admission. Somewhere between 1/4 of everyone in this landscape was owned by somebody else. And the discipline of saying so properly is to say that we cannot narrow it further than that. What we do have, in unusual detail, is a payroll. Athens had a habit that has served us extremely well. It published its public spending on stone. When the state was paying for a building, the commissioners in charge had to set out what had gone where, item by item, cut into marble and stood up in public where any citizen with the patience could go and audit it. Fragments of these accounts survive from the work on the Acropolis. And because the clerks were recording payments rather than making a point, they recorded exactly who was paid and what he was, and how much. The fullest of them were cut about 20 years after the summer we are standing in, and that gap has to be said plainly rather than slid past. But the arrangement they describe was not invented in that decade, and there is nothing else remotely like them. Of the workmen whose status the clerks bothered to note, roughly a quarter were Athenian citizens, well over half were resident foreigners, and about a fifth were slaves. They are all on the stone together, in the same columns, doing the same jobs, fluting columns, smoothing wall blocks, working on the scaffolding, and the rate is a drachma a day for skilled and unskilled alike, with piecework priced off the same figure. Citizen, foreigner, and slave were paid the same money for the same work. The entries name them. A man called Somenes, described as belonging to Ameniades, is down for 18 drachmas. A man called Sindron, belonging to Simmias, is down for 12 drachmas and 5 obols. Their names are on a public monument in the middle of Athens because the accounting required it, and that clerical necessity is the entire reason we know either of them existed. There is one thing in these accounts that needs no translation whatsoever. Anybody who has worked for money knows the specific sensation of seeing a day of their own life converted into a figure by somebody else and written down somewhere other people can see it. The Athenians did that in marble in the center of the city, permanently. But the equality on that stone is arithmetic, and it needs to be read for exactly as much as it says. A flute cut into a column takes the same labor whoever cuts it, and Athens had no interest at all in who did the cutting. Athens had a total and precise interest in whose hand the coin went into at the end of the day. Sindron's 12 drachmas and 5 obols were paid, formally, to Simmias. What Sindron himself saw of that money, and there is evidence for arrangements in which enslaved men lived apart, worked for themselves and handed over a fixed sum, was a matter of private negotiation, not of right, and could be altered by the person who owned him whenever he chose. There is one further piece of the law that belongs here and should be stated once, without dressing. In an Athenian court, the evidence of an enslaved person was admissible only if it had been extracted under torture. A free man swore an oath and spoke. A slave was tortured, and this was not an abuse or a scandal. It was the correct procedure discussed in surviving courtroom speeches as a routine question of evidence, with litigants formally challenging one another over whose slaves should be handed across for the purpose. The justification offered was that a slave would otherwise lie to protect his owner. It is the clearest single statement the city ever made about what it took a slave to be. Not a witness whose word might be believed or doubted, but a source that had to be opened before anything came out. The other stones, the ones recording that confiscation auction with its doors and its bronze pots and its standing crops, reached the people last, at the bottom of the columns, after the furniture. A Carian child went for 72 drachmas, which is the lowest figure anywhere in the surviving fragments. A Thracian man went for 115, a Scythian for 144, a Lydian woman for 151, a Thracian woman for 165. A Syrian appears twice, in separate lots, at 240 and 301. The highest price on any fragment is 360 drachmas, for a Carian who was a goldsmith. 44 sales survive in total, 37 of them men and 9 of them women. Set against a skilled man's drachma a day, the child is about 10 weeks of wages, and the goldsmith is more than a year of them. What raises the price is skill, and nothing else does. That is the whole logic of the document, and it is stated by a clerk who was not making an argument. You can go and look at these stones. They are in a museum in Athens, and what strikes anyone standing in front of them first is that the lettering is beautiful. Athenian public inscription of this period is cut in an exact grid, each letter set directly beneath the one above it, so that the whole face of the marble reads like ruled paper. Somebody was paid to do that, and did it well, and did it no differently for these lines than for any others. And the difference between the two kinds of stone is the thing to carry away. On the building accounts, the enslaved men have names, because a payroll cannot function without them. On the sale list, there are no names at all. There is a country of origin and a figure, and the country of origin is standing in for a life. The 9 women on that list are not described. The accounts do not record women anywhere of any status because the work Athenian women did inside a house was not work that anybody paid for in public and carved into marble. What a woman brought into a household did, there was the household's labour, the wool, the water, the cooking, the children, and whatever else the man who owned her wanted, which he was not required to explain to anyone. Beyond that, we have the upright loom that stood in the corner of every courtyard in Athens, its threads pulled straight by rows of little clay weights, and a very large silence around the people who worked at it. She is 14 or possibly 15, and the conversation that will settle the rest of her life is going on in a different part of the house. She is not in it. She has, in all likelihood, never met the man being discussed, and depending on the household, she may not be told the outcome for a while yet. The agreement is not between the two people who will spend 40 years sharing a courtyard. It is between her father and the man who wants her, and it takes the form of a verbal contract and a handshake, witnessed by whoever happens to be standing there. Most people have had a much smaller version of this. The meeting about you that you are not in, the decision that arrives already finished, the sensation of learning your own situation from somebody who worked it out in another room. And it is worth being clear that there is nothing exotic in the arrangement itself. Marriage as a treaty between two households negotiated by men, secured with property, and entered into for the purpose of producing heirs is the ordinary human pattern across most of recorded history and a great deal of the present world. The version where two people select each other on grounds of feeling and inform their families afterwards is the local and very recent departure. Of the two of us, we are the strange ones. The formula that survives, preserved in comedies written rather later than our summer, and generally taken to reflect classical practice, has the father hand the woman over for the ploughing of legitimate children. That is the stated purpose, and it is not a metaphor anyone was embarrassed by. It also had a precise legal weight because 20 years before this morning, Pericles had carried a law restricting Athenian citizenship to children with an Athenian mother and an Athenian father both, which makes a properly contracted marriage between two Athenian households the only machine in existence for producing Athenians. Everything about the institution, the negotiation, the witnesses, the dowry, the public procession, exists to make the resulting children unambiguous. The dowry is where it gets more interesting than the summary suggests. Money and goods went with her, and her husband had the use of them, but they did not simply become his. The dowry stayed attached to her, and if the marriage ended, by divorce or by her dying childless, it had to go back to the family that provided it, which meant that a man had a substantial financial reason not to send his wife away, and her father and brothers had a permanent, enforceable interest in how she was getting on. A woman with a large dowry was, in the plainest practical terms, harder to treat badly. That is not the same as power, and it should not be dressed up as power. It is leverage, held on her behalf by men, and it worked in her favor to exactly the extent that her male relatives chose to use it. But it was real, and it is one of the reasons the flat description of an Athenian wife as property does not quite survive contact with the evidence. The age gap is the other thing that needs explaining rather than simply reporting. She is 14. He is likely to be somewhere around 30, because an Athenian man married when he could support a household, which meant after his military service and after he had established himself in a trade or come into land. She married as soon as she could bear children. The consequence, arithmetically, is that a great many Athenian wives outlived their husbands by decades, and a great many marriages had a husband who was also, functionally, an instructor. Xenophon left a description of exactly this, written a generation or so after our summer, in which a man explains how he trained his young wife to run his house. She had not yet turned 15 when she came to him, he says. And up to that point she had been brought up under careful supervision so that she might see as little as possible, hear as little as possible, and ask the fewest possible questions. He is not complaining. He offers it as a description of a girl properly raised, in a portrait meant to be admired, which tells us with unusual clarity what an Athenian gentleman thought was worth admiring. Against all of that sits the picture everyone carries of the Athenian wife, shut away in a women's quarter at the back of the house, invisible for life. And here the archaeology has quietly complicated things. When you excavate Greek houses in any number, what you find is not the layout that picture requires. The houses are small and irregular. They grew by addition rather than plan. And there is very rarely anything identifiable as a separate women's wing. Rooms do not have fixed functions the way ours do. A room is whatever is happening in it that afternoon. What the architecture does control, consistently and carefully, is the line of sight from the street, the door offset, the courtyard screened, so that a man standing at the entrance can see almost nothing of the household. Lisa Nevitt, who has spent a career reading Greek houses as social documents rather than floor plans, put the reinterpretation most usefully. The women's quarter is better understood as the part of the house a male visitor does not go into. It is relational, not architectural. It moves. When there is nobody at the door, it is not anywhere at all. If you have ever been in a small house when an unexpected visitor arrives and watched the family quietly reorganize itself into the rooms the visitor is not going to enter, you have seen the mechanism working. Seclusion was also, straightforwardly, expensive. It requires enough slaves to do the fetching and enough rooms to withdraw into, and most Athenian households had neither. Poor women went out because the alternative was going without. They queued for their own water, sold bread and vegetables and garlands in the market, hired themselves out as wet nurses, took in weaving for pay. The comic poets scored points off politicians whose mothers had sold produce, and the joke only lands because it was both true and a mark of poverty. What was actually being described when Athenians talked about respectable women staying indoors was a standard the wealthy could afford and everyone else aspired to. Which brings us to the difficulty at the center of this whole subject, and it is a different difficulty from the one the enslaved present. Athenian women are not absent from the evidence. They are all over it. They are named on gravestones, dowered in contracts, argued about in courtrooms, painted on thousands of pots, put on stage as queens and priestesses and rebels in front of audiences of thousands. The material is abundant. Almost none of it is theirs. Consider Aspasia, who is the most famous woman in classical Athens by a distance. She came from Miletus, she lived with Pericles. They had a son. Beyond that, What survives is comic abuse from playwrights who were really attacking Pericles and found her a convenient way in. A passage in Plato written after her death, which is doing something literary rather than reporting, and a full biography by Plutarch, composed around 500 years later. There is not one line she wrote. There is not one sentence anybody recorded her saying while she was alive to correct it. The best documented woman in the city is documented entirely by men who wanted something from the portrait. Even the gravestones are somebody else's sentence. The epitaph was composed by whoever paid for the stone. So when the wedding comes, we can describe it in real detail, and we can describe nothing at all of what it was like. It runs across 3 days. On the first, she takes her childhood to a sanctuary and gives it away. Her toys, her dolls, a lock of her hair, dedicated most often to Artemis. That is the formal end of being a child, and it is performed as a transaction with a goddess. On the second day, both households wash. Water is fetched from a particular spring in a tall jar kept for the purpose, and she is bathed, dressed, crowned, and veiled. There is a feast at her father's house with the men and women eating apart. At some point, she uncovers her face to her husband for the first time and receives gifts for doing it, though the sources place that moment variously at the feast and at the arrivals, and it cannot be fixed. And then, after dark, the street. They go from her father's house to his by torchlight, on foot or in a cart, with pipes playing and a crowd of relatives singing the wedding song, and everyone along the route knows exactly what is passing. His mother is waiting at the door with torches of her own. The couple are led to the hearth, and nuts and dried figs are poured over their heads for luck, and the household gods are asked to take in one more. What you can see from the street is the light going along the wall, and the crowd, and a veiled girl in the middle of it. You can hear the pipes for a while after they have turned the corner. Then a door in a blank wall opens and takes her in and shuts. The largest object in the room is a bowl. It stands near the middle on the floor or on a low stand, wide across the mouth and deep in the body, painted inside and out, and filling it is work for 2 hands and a certain amount of care. Nothing gets drunk in this house until something has happened in that bowl, and what happens in it is the whole difference between an Athenian evening and a foreign one. Wine here is never taken as it comes. It arrives at the house strong and often thick, closer to a syrup than to anything we would recognize, and it is cut with water before a drop reaches a cup. 3 parts water to 1 of wine is a figure that turns up repeatedly in the sources. 5 to 2 appears, and 5 to 3, and 1 to 1, which is a serious night and gets commented on as such. Drinking it neat was the mark of a foreigner, and more specifically, of a Thracian or a Scythian. And there was a story in circulation that a Spartan king had learned the habit from Scythians and gone mad from it. Whether that is true matters less than the fact that Athenians repeated it. They had decided what unmixed wine meant, and it meant a man with no floor under him. The room this happens in is the only room in an Athenian house built for a single purpose, and it is possible to identify one by the doorway alone. The door sits off to one side rather than in the center of the wall, because the couches run continuously round the inside of the room, and a central door would break the line. 7 of them, or 11 or 15 in a grand house. The number is set by the walls, not by the guest list. The floor is finished harder than the rest of the house, sometimes in waterproofed cement, sometimes sloping very slightly toward a corner. That is not decoration. The floor is built on the assumption that it is going to need washing. Dinner comes first, and it is a separate event. The men eat, sitting up, off small tables brought in beside the couches. The food is cleared, the tables taken out, hands and mouths are washed. Garlands go on, and scented oil. A libation is poured to the good spirit, and a hymn is sung. And the libation, alone in the whole evening, is of unmixed wine. The only neat wine in the house goes to a god. Then the bowl is filled, and the drinking, which is a different thing from the eating and has its own rules, begins. Those rules have an officer. At the start of the evening, the company appoints one man to run it, and his authority covers exactly two things: how much water goes into the wine and how fast the cups go round. He is not a host and not a toastmaster. He is closer to a valve. There is something in that arrangement that deserves more attention than it usually gets. This is a culture that produced, within a couple of generations, an enormous body of thinking about self-mastery, about the proper relationship between a man and his appetites, about moderation as the foundation of everything else a person might be. And it did not, in practice, leave that to the individual conscience. It elected somebody and gave him a jug. The theory of self-control was administered by committee, by the ladleful, all evening in a room designed to be hosed down afterwards. Every drinking culture invents this machinery in some form, and ours is no more sophisticated for being informal. The friend who fetches water, the person who quietly stops ordering, the unspoken agreement about when it becomes a late one. The Athenians simply gave the job a title and made it visible. The wider point about appetite was made most usefully by James Davidson, whose argument is that these anxieties were not separate, that fish and wine and desire formed a single system in Athenian public life, one language for talking about whether a man could be trusted with power. Being unable to control what you wanted was not a private failing. It was a political disqualification, and it could be said about you in court. What that evening actually consisted of, we know largely from the cups. Athenian drinking vessels are covered in pictures of Athenian drinking, painted by men who sold them to the people in the pictures, and that gives us a great deal of detail and one significant caution. These are images of the evening as its participants preferred to see it. The most famous literary symposium, Plato's, was written well after the night it describes, and is a work of philosophy wearing a party as a costume, not a transcript. Still, if you were on one of those couches, propped on your left elbow with your right hand free, what you would have in that hand is a broad, shallow cup on a stem. And the shallowness is deliberate, because a cup like that cannot be drained in a hurry, and it shows the painting inside as the wine goes down. Conversation moves round the room in order. So do songs. Each man takes a turn, and a myrtle branch is passed along the couches to mark whose turn it is, which means nobody gets to hide. Riddles go round, so do challenges to cap a line of verse with a better one. And there is a game. You keep the last mouthful of wine in the bottom of your cup, hook one finger through the handle and flick the dregs across the room at a target, usually a small bronze disc, balanced on top of a stand, the object being to knock it off so it falls with a clatter. It requires an awkward wrist action, and people were good at it and bet on it. The best detail is that you threw for somebody. You said the name of the person you wanted as you flicked, and whether you hit told you how that was going to go. It is a drinking game and a love oracle at the same time, played by grown men with wine dregs, and the equipment turns up in the archaeological record because it was manufactured for the purpose. The music is provided by a girl standing in the corner, playing a pair of pipes held one in each hand, and she has been hired for the night. She is almost certainly not free. Neither are the boys carrying the jug round the couches, nor most of the women who may or may not be in the room, depending on the evening. The professional companions whose glamour in our sources was written down entirely by their clients, and who were, in the great majority of cases, either enslaved or recently freed and working off the debt. An Athenian handbook of city administration, written down a good deal later than our summer, lists among the duties of the market officials the enforcement of a maximum hire price for a pipe girl, and instructs them that, where two men want the same one, the officials are to draw lots. That is the arrangement, and it should be said in the room while the lamps are still lit, rather than added afterwards as a note. The pleasure of the evening was real. The conversation was real and often extraordinary. Some of the best thinking in human history came out of rooms like this one. It ran in part on people who had not agreed to be there and had no mechanism by which to decline. And what happened to the girl with the pipes when the singing stopped was decided by the men on the couches, and no source anywhere records anyone asking her. There is a second thing this room contained, and it needs setting out in order rather than in outrage. Athenian society had a formalized relationship between an adult man and an adolescent boy of citizen family. A courtship conducted publicly, with gifts of hares and gamecocks that appear on hundreds of pots, and an understanding that the older man would sponsor the younger into the world of adult men. Around free boys, the city built an actual fence. There were laws known to us best from a prosecution more than a century later, but older than that case, penalizing anyone who hired out a free boy and barring from public speech for life any citizen who had sold himself. A boy of good family did not walk to school unaccompanied. A household slave went with him, and part of that man's job was keeping adults at a distance. The fence was carefully built, and it enclosed free boys. It did not extend to enslaved children who were present in these houses in numbers, and there is no ancient argument about their position because no ancient writer thought there was a question there. Late on, the lamps start to want refilling, which is the clock this house actually runs on, and the company goes out into the street to find its way home in whatever condition it has arrived at. What is left behind is the bowl, more or less empty, and the cups, and the myrtle branch, and a hard floor with a slight fall to one corner, laid by a builder who knew precisely what the room was for. Somebody washed it in the morning. Nobody wrote that person's name down. Athens at night has no lighting of any kind. Men going home from a long evening take a torch, or a slave with a lamp, and everybody else stays indoors, and the streets between the houses are as dark as the inside of a cupboard. There is nobody out in them whose job it is to be there. That last point is worth taking slowly, because it is not a matter of the watch being thin or the constables being corrupt. There was no institution in Athens whose function was to patrol the streets, prevent crime, investigate a theft, or go and find the man who had done it. A corps of state-owned archers existed, several hundred of them, and what they were for was keeping order at public gatherings. If somebody dug through the side of your house in the night, and the ordinary word for a burglar tells you how they got in, you woke up to a hole in your wall and an empty room, and there was nobody to tell, no office to report to, no procedure that began without you. What happened next was entirely yours to organize, and every step of it, from finding out who did it to standing up and saying so, you did yourself, at your own expense. Most of us have run into a small version of that discovery. The moment you realize that the thing you assumed was somebody's job is in fact nobody's job, and that the only mechanism available is you. Athens ran its whole criminal law on that principle, deliberately. In a private matter, a theft, an assault, an unpaid debt, damage to your land, the case was brought by the person harmed. In a public matter, one that touched the city rather than an individual, the prosecutor was whoever chose to be. The phrase that appears in the laws is "anyone who wishes," and it is not a piece of rhetoric. It is the mechanism. The enforcement of Athenian law began in every instance with a private man deciding that this particular wrong was worth several days of his life and a quantity of his own money. A system built that way has a predictable problem, which is that most people will decide it is not worth it, and Athens solved it in the predictable manner. In a range of public cases, the successful prosecutor took a cut, a share of the fine, or of the property confiscated. What that produced was a recognized Athenian character, the man who prosecuted for a living, who read the statutes looking for openings, and his fellow citizens looking for targets. There was a word for him. It was thoroughly insulting, and it has come into English as sycophant, having drifted a very long way from what it originally meant. The brake on all this had real teeth. If you brought a public prosecution and failed to convince a fifth of the jury, you were fined 1,000 drachmas and barred from bringing that kind of case ever again. 1,000 drachmas is something over 3 years of a skilled man's wages. The city wanted volunteers, and it wanted them fairly sure of themselves before they opened their mouths. If you caught a man in the act, the procedure was more direct. You seized him, with whatever help was standing nearby, and walked him to a board of magistrates called the 11. 11 citizens chosen by lot for a year, who kept the prison and carried out the executions. If the man you had dragged in admitted what he had done, the 11 could put him to death without any trial whatsoever. Everything contested went before a jury, and the juries were enormous. 6,000 men enrolled and swore an oath at the start of each year. Any citizen over 30 could put his name in. Out of that pool came panels of 201 for smaller private suits, 401 and 501 for public ones, and 1,000 or 1,500 for the political trials that everybody wanted to watch. The numbers are always odd, so that there can be no tie. There is no judge in this room. A magistrate presides, which means he opens proceedings and keeps order, and he has no authority over the law or the evidence. He does not sum up. He does not tell the jury what the statute means because nobody has appointed him to know. There are no lawyers either. Each side speaks for himself, and although you could pay a professional to compose your speech and learn it by heart, and there were men making very good money doing exactly that, the words had to come out of your own mouth, in your own voice, standing up. The pay is 2 obols a day. Set against 3 obols for an unskilled day's labour, it is not a living, but it is most of one for sitting down. Almost all of that is recognisable. The summons, the day surrendered, the money that does not really cover it, a stranger's affairs placed in the hands of people who did not ask for them. None of that would puzzle anybody who has done jury service. What would puzzle them is everything else, that there is no judge to defer to, no direction on the law, 500 colleagues rather than 11, no room to withdraw to, no discussion of any kind, and no appeal from whatever happens next. The speeches were timed with water. The device is a clay vessel with a short bronze pipe set into it near the base. You fill it to the line, the plug comes out, and it empties itself through the pipe. When it stops running, you stop talking. One was recovered from the excavations of the old market square, with a tribe's name and a capacity mark scratched on the side, and it holds a little over 6 litres, which takes about 6 minutes to run through. An attendant stopped the flow with his thumb whenever a law or a contract or a witness's written statement was read out, so that the 6 minutes were strictly your own words and nobody else's. It sits in a museum case now, a few hundred yards from the ground it was used on. What strikes people standing in front of it is how utterly ordinary the thing is. A plain pot with a hole near the bottom, unglazed, slightly lopsided, with somebody's rough lettering on the shoulder. Nothing about it announces that it was ever used to measure out the last chance a man had to explain himself. That sound is not an exotic one either. Anyone who has been given a fixed number of minutes to account for themselves in front of a panel knows exactly what it does to the sentences. You begin editing while you are still speaking. You cut the part that would have taken too long, and it is very often the part that mattered. By the time Aristophanes wrote a comedy about all this, 8 years after our summer, he could rely on every man in the theatre knowing somebody like his main character. The old man at the center of it is so completely addicted to jury service that his son has locked him in the house to keep him off the panels. Netting over the courtyard, guards on the door, and he keeps trying to escape down the chimney and out through the drain. The chorus who come to rescue him are his fellow jurors, elderly, poor, ferocious, and dressed as wasps, because the joke is that they sting. The father's name means Cleon lover, and the son's means Cleon hater, which tells the audience the political argument before either of them opens his mouth. In the end, the son compromises by building his father a courtroom in the yard, and the first case tried in it is the household dog, prosecuted for the theft of a cheese. Under the farce, there is something plain. For a poor old Athenian, the jury was the whole of public life at once: the income, the company, the outing, and several hours a day during which men considerably richer than himself stood in front of him and pleaded. When the water had run out on both sides, the vote happened immediately. There was no retiring, no deliberation, no conferring at all. Each juror took a pebble as he filed past and dropped it into one of 2 urns, and the urns were emptied and counted where everyone could see. If the man was convicted and the law did not fix the punishment, there was a second round, and its design is the cruelest thing in the whole apparatus. The prosecutor proposed a penalty. The convicted man proposed a different one. The jury then chose between those two and was not permitted to invent anything in between. A man who had just been found guilty had to work out, standing there, how much punishment to ask for himself. Enough to look as though he accepted the verdict, not so much that he handed away years of his life. And misjudging it was fatal. The penalties ran from fines up through the loss of citizen rights to exile and death was the business of the 11, hemlock, or being fastened to a plank and left, or the pit outside the walls. All of it inside a day. No appeal from any verdict in any circumstance. No transcript. The 500 men walked out into the afternoon and went home, and whatever collective reasoning they had arrived at existed nowhere except inside their own heads, and died with them. It is tempting to file this under charming amateurism, and that is the wrong draw. Athens was not short of intelligent men who could have been trained to judge. It had made a decision. A permanent class of experts who determined what the law meant was, in the Athenian reading, precisely the thing a democracy exists to prevent. And so the law meant whatever several hundred ordinary men said it meant on a Tuesday. They ruled on the facts and the law together because they did not accept that these were 2 different questions. The cost was not hidden from them. A life could be settled in an afternoon by strangers who owed the man no explanation and never gave one, and there was nowhere to go afterwards. And the apparatus of all this, the most argued-over legal system the ancient world produced, the one every later system has had to reckon with, was made of the cheapest material available. A pot with a hole in it measured out a man's time. A handful of river pebbles ended his case. When the city wanted something to write a name on, it used broken crockery, of which there was an unlimited supply, turned out by the ton in workshops on the far side of the city by men who were paid by the piece. On the waste ground behind a workshop in the Potter's Quarter, in among several tons of broken material, there is a fragment of a wine jar that is the wrong colour. It should be black where the background is and orange where the figures are. Instead, the whole of it has come out a flat, chalky orange-brown, the drawing still visible as a faint ghost, the whole surface dead. Somebody carried it out of the kiln, looked at it, and threw it on the heap without a second thought, along with the rest of that morning's failures. 2,500 years later, it is one of the more useful things in the quarter, because it tells you exactly how close to the edge these men were working. The colour is the entire job. Athenian clay is full of iron, which means it fires orange-red in an ordinary open fire, and that orange-red is the colour of every plain pot in the city. The black is not paint and it is not glaze. It is the same clay. Settled out in water until only the very finest particles are left, then treated so that it will fuse at a lower heat than the body of the pot beneath it. Painted on and fired in air, it would come out the same orange as everything else. What makes it black is what happens inside the kiln. The firing runs in 3 stages and the potter is steering blind through all of them. First, air in, the vents open, the fire clean, the temperature climbing to somewhere around 900 degrees, and everything in the chamber turning red. Then the vents are shut and green wood or damp leaves go in, and the fire begins to starve. Smoke fills the chamber, the oxygen goes, and the iron in the clay changes character. Every surface in there turns black, the fine painted slip and the coarse body alike. Then the vents come open again. Air returns. The coarse body of the pot, which is still porous, takes the oxygen back up and goes red once more. And the fine layer, which has fused solid, cannot and stays black forever. There is no thermometer and no clock. The margin between the temperature at which the slip fuses properly and the temperature at which the whole pot begins to slump is not wide, and the whole of it is judged by eye through a small hole in the kiln wall. By the colour of the glow, and by the smell, and by pulling out small clay test pieces on a hooked rod and looking at how they have come along. Some of those test pieces have survived. They are among the least impressive objects the ancient world has left us, and they are a straight window into how anxious the process was. Then the kiln is left to cool, and it is not opened early, because opening it early cracks everything inside. If you were standing in that yard when the wall came down, the first thing you would meet is the heat still coming off the stack, and the second is that nobody is looking at the pictures. They are looking at the colour. In a good load, the black is even and slightly metallic, and the red is clean, and the master will be counting as he goes. In a bad one, the black has come up brown and thin in the places where the fire ran too fast. And those pots are seconds, and the ones that have slumped or cracked or fused to their neighbours go on the heap outside. Nobody is dismayed. A proportion of every load has always gone that way, and the price of the surviving pots is set in the knowledge that it will. There is a particular pleasure in watching this that has not aged at all. A whole workshop of people who know precisely what they are doing, working fast at something that cannot be hurried, in an order that was worked out before any of them were born. The shop itself is small. A master, a couple of trained hands, some boys, and often enough a slave or two working alongside the free men on the same terms as the men on the Acropolis scaffolding. The wheel is turned by a boy or an assistant so that the thrower has both hands free. The work is repetitive and cold and wet at one end of the yard and savagely hot at the other, and a competent thrower turns out drinking cups by the dozen all day, because at the prices these things fetch there was no other way to make a living from them. One of the men working in this quarter right now, in the very years we are standing in, produced some of the most admired objects the ancient world has left behind, and we do not know his name. He is called the Achilles painter, which is not a name but a catalogue label, assigned by modern scholars after a figure of Achilles on a jar in the Vatican. Almost all Athenian vase painters are known this way. What happened over the last century and a half is that specialists learned to read individual hands across thousands of pots, the way one man does an ear or a knee or the fold of a cloak, and reassembled entire careers from the evidence, workshop by workshop, pupil by pupil, without ever recovering a single name. Which produces a strange inversion of the stones we have already been reading. On the Acropolis accounts, a man has a name and nothing else. We know Somenes existed, and not one thing he made. Here we have 200 surviving objects by one pair of hands, and can watch that pair of hands get better over 30 years, and have no idea what to call him. His speciality by these years is a particular kind of oil flask, tall, narrow, coated in a white slip, with the figures drawn in fine outline and the colours added after firing rather than before. The colours were therefore fragile, and on most surviving examples they have largely gone. That was not an oversight. These flasks were made almost exclusively to be left at graves. They are barely found outside Attica at all, and they were never intended to be handled again. What a man could earn from any of this is visible on the Acropolis accounts, once you read them for rates rather than for status. Sculptural work was priced by the piece. 60 drachmas for a single standing figure, 120 for a horse with a man beside it, 240 for a group with a chariot in it. Pyromachos of Caphesia is down for 60. A foreigner living over in the Melite district is down for 120. Piece rates change how a person works, and anybody who has been paid that way knows how. The arithmetic runs constantly in the back of the head. How long this one is taking, whether the next one can be done faster, whether the difficult commission at the better rate is actually the better rate once you count the days. 60 drachmas is 60 days of a skilled man's wages. So whether Pyromachos was doing well depends entirely on how long a figure took him. And the accounts do not say. If a figure was 2 months' work, he was earning exactly what the man fluting columns beside him earned. If it was 3 weeks, he was doing very nicely indeed. We cannot get closer than that. 80 years before our summer in this same quarter, a painter finished a wine jar with 3 men on it, dancing home drunk. Bodies twisted, one seen from behind, a shoulder foreshortened, poses that nobody had managed to draw before. And when it was done, he wrote a line along the edge of it. Not his signature alone, though, that is there too. The line says, in effect, as never Euphronios. Euphronios was a real man, working at the same time, a few streets away, painting the same shapes for the same customers. Nobody knows what the tone of it was. It could be a genuine rivalry, or a standing joke between 2 shops, or straightforward advertising aimed at a buyer who knew both names. What is certain is that a working tradesman wrote his competitor's name onto a piece of stock in paint and let it walk out of the yard. And the jar was sold and shipped to Italy and buried in an Etruscan tomb with somebody who very probably had no idea who Euphronios was, and came up out of the ground in 1829, and now stands in a case in Munich with the line still legible along the top. That impulse is not ancient in any meaningful sense. It is the mark on the underside, the initials in the wet concrete, the name in the corner of the work, the quiet certainty that somebody, at some point, will turn the thing over and look. Euthymides simply added the other name as well, so that both of them would be read together by strangers, which is more or less what has happened. And on the mornings when the assembly met, some of the men in these yards banked the fire, shut the shop, and walked across the city, and some of them did not. The difference between those two groups turned out to matter more than almost anything else about them. The rope was soaked in red ochre, and the men carrying it were archers belonging to the state. And on the mornings when the assembly met, they used it to sweep people up the hill. 2 men took an end each and walked it across the open ground at about waist height, and everyone still standing about, arguing at a stall, waiting on someone, deliberately not going, got caught in it and moved along in front of it like sheep. The ochre came off on the cloth. A man who arrived at the meeting with a broad red stripe across his cloak had a certain difficulty, because the mark was evidence that he had needed driving, and there was a fine for it. The distance between believing in how a country ought to be run and actually getting up and going somewhere about it is not a recent discovery. Athens had noticed it, thought about it, and dealt with it in the way it dealt with most things, which was practically and without much dignity. It stained its citizens. What makes this stranger is that the men being driven up the hill were not being paid. Sitting on a jury brought in 2 obols a day, and there were old men in this city who effectively lived on it. Attending the assembly, the body that decided on war, on money, on treaties, on whether the fleet sailed, brought in nothing at all. Payment for turning up was introduced decades later, after the war was lost and the democracy had been overthrown and restored, and one of the reasons given was that otherwise the poor could not afford to come. In this summer, a potter who shut his shop to go and vote on the conduct of the war lost a day's earnings for the privilege. Some did it, and some could not, and the rope existed because of the second group. The place itself is a bare hillside west of the market, cut back into a terrace and held up on one side by a retaining wall, with a low platform of rock at the front for whoever is speaking. There are no seats. 6,000 men can get onto it standing or sitting on the ground, and 6,000 is also the number required to make certain kinds of decision valid, which suggests the terrace was cut to the Constitution rather than the other way round. How often it met in these particular years is not certain. A century later, it had settled into 40 times a year, and in this decade it was probably a good deal less, with extra meetings called when something happened. Before any business, the ground was purified. Young pigs were carried round the edge of the assembly place and killed, and their blood was used to mark the boundary of the space. Then a herald spoke a prayer, and after the prayer a curse against anyone who spoke in order that the people should be deceived. And then, with the crowd settled and the sun coming up over the city, the herald asked the question that opened every meeting of the sovereign body of Athens. Who wishes to speak? Not the council, not the elected men, not the ones with property, not the ones who had spoken before. Anyone. Any citizen on that hillside could walk down to the front and address 6,000 of his neighbours on the conduct of a war, and if what he said carried the room, that was the policy. Most did not, and the same few dozen men did most of the talking, and everybody knew that. But the question was asked out loud every time, and it was not rhetorical. Voting was done by putting an arm in the air. The presiding officers looked at the crowd, formed a view about which side had more arms up, and declared it. There was no count. The most consequential decisions in the Greek world, to sail, to besiege, to execute, to make peace, were settled by a handful of men squinting at a hillside and making an estimate. Underneath all of this sits an idea that most modern listeners have to read twice, which is that the Athenians regarded elections as undemocratic. The reasoning is not complicated once it is stated. An election, in their analysis, will always favour the well-known, the well-connected, the fluent, and the rich, because those are the men whose names come to mind and whose speeches persuade. It selects for a certain kind of person, and it selects the same kind repeatedly. A lottery does not. A lottery treats every citizen as equally fit to hold office, which is either the founding claim of democracy or nonsense depending on where you stand. And Athens had decided which. So the archons were chosen by lot. The council was chosen by lot. The magistrates who ran the prison and the market and the roads were chosen by lot. The only significant offices filled by election were the ones where incompetence would kill people. The 10 generals, and the men who handled large sums of money. And even those were reviewed annually and could be prosecuted at the end of their term. The council was 500 men, 50 from each of the 10 tribes, drawn by lot from any citizen over 30 who put himself forward, for 1 year, and no man could serve more than twice in his life. Nothing could be put before the assembly that the council had not prepared first, which means the agenda of the sovereign body was set by 500 amateurs who had been picked out of a hat. Each tribe's 50 took over the running of the state for a tenth of the year, and while they were on duty they lived in a round building beside the market square. They ate there at public expense. A third of them slept there every night, so that there was never an hour in which nobody had authority to act for the city. A permanent duty watch of ordinary men in a round house, on rotation, forever. And every day at sunset, a lot was drawn among the 50 on duty to decide which one of them would be chairman. He held the office for 1 night and 1 day. He could not hold it twice, ever. For that single night and day he had the seal of the city and the keys to the sanctuaries where the treasuries were kept, and he did not go home. He stayed in the round house with his third of the watch, and in the morning he presided over whatever the day brought, and at sunset the lot was drawn again, and it was somebody else. Nobody has a precise figure for how many Athenian men held that office, because the records do not survive in that form. But 500 councillors a year, with the chairmanship turning over daily, adds up quickly, and the reckoning most historians arrive at is that a very substantial share of the men who lived past 30 in this city spent 1 day and 1 night as its head of state, and then went back to the shop. Removing people was handled with the same instinct. Once a year, the assembly could vote on whether to hold an ostracism, and if it decided to, every citizen who came scratched a name on a broken piece of pot and dropped it in. The man with the most votes left Attica for 10 years. He kept his property, he lost no rights, no charge was brought, and no case was made. The city simply decided it would rather not have him about for a while. The procedure was not always as spontaneous as it sounds. One surviving deposit of these ballots, all naming the same politician, was found to have been written by only about a dozen different hands. Somebody had prepared them in bulk and handed them out. And in this summer, the assembly turned on the man who had led it into the war. It fined Pericles and removed him from the generalship, the same body that had followed his strategy for 2 years, meeting on the same hillside, voting the same way, with a show of arms. They elected him again the following year. The record is quite clear that both things happened, and that neither required anything more than a majority of the men who had bothered to come. Whether all of this deserves the word democracy is a fair question, and it should be asked properly, rather than settled quickly. The word is theirs, not ours. The strength of the people, and they meant it flatly, and it alarmed every oligarchy in Greece. But the people it referred to were adult male citizens with 2 Athenian parents, somewhere between 30 and 60,000 men, inside a resident population of perhaps 350,000. Women were outside it entirely. Resident foreigners paid tax and served in the army and were outside it. The enslaved were not in the category at all. On any modern accounting, something around a tenth of the people in Attica had any voice whatsoever. And inside that 10th, the thing was more radical than anything attempted since. No representative standing in for anybody. No professional class of politicians. Offices distributed by lottery. Direct votes on peace and war, taken by the men who would have to march. Both of those statements are true at once, and the honest position is to hold them together rather than choose the one that suits. It is also worth being clear that the exclusions were not a live argument being lost. There was, for the most part, no argument. Nobody on that hillside was making the case and failing, which leaves the man in the round house, on his one night, with the keys. He did not stand for it. He did not want it particularly, and he could not decline it, and it would not come again. Somewhere in the same building, the rest of the watch were asleep, and outside the door, the city was dark and unpoliced, and the seal was in his keeping until the sun came up. If you have ever been handed something you were not qualified for, by a process that did not consult you, and sat up with it half the night, working out what you would do if the thing you were afraid of actually happened, then you have the shape of it. The Athenians simply made that experience compulsory, and then arranged for almost everyone to have a turn. 4 miles down the walled road, the city ends in salt water. What reaches you first at Piraeus is pitch. It is being boiled somewhere along the shore for the hulls, and the smell of it sits over everything else. Over the rope walks, the wet timber, the barrels of salt fish, the flour dust drifting off a grain quay, and under all of it the harbour itself, which at low tide smells like every working harbour that has ever existed. The noise is different from the cities. Fewer voices and more equipment, blocks and tackle hammering the particular slap of water against stone. There are 3 harbours here. One of them handles cargo and the other 2 hold the fleet, drawn up out of the water in long ranks of roofed slipways so the hulls stay dry and light between voyages. There are hundreds of those sheds. From a rise above the town, they are the most impressive man-made thing in Greece after the temples, and they are simply a car park for warships. The town around them does not look like Athens at all. Athens grew, and its streets are the accidental gaps between houses that were put up whenever somebody needed one. Piraeus was planned, laid out in the middle of this century on a grid, with straight streets crossing at right angles and blocks of a regular size, and the man usually credited with the plan came from Miletus. He was not Athenian, which means that the most rationally organized town in the Greek world was designed by somebody who was not permitted to own a house in it. Down on the commercial quay, there is a building whose whole function is samples. A cargo arrives, and rather than unload the entire ship for inspection, the merchant brings a portion of it up and lays it out, grain from one place, oil from another, hides, timber, salt fish, iron, all of it side by side under a roof, with the men who deal in each standing beside their own. If you came down here to buy, that is where you would go first, walking along the tables and putting your hand into a heap of barley from 400 miles away, and the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean would be laid out in front of you in quantities you could hold. The grain is the part that matters. Attica does not grow enough to feed Attica, and has not for a long time, and the shortfall arrives here in ships from the Black Sea and Egypt and Sicily, which is a sentence with a navy in it. The obsessive Athenian interest in the straits at the top of the Aegean, the willingness to fight over places nobody had otherwise heard of, all of that is the same fact expressed at the level of policy. This city's dinner came in through a channel a few hundred yards wide, and the channel had to belong to somebody. A very large part of the work of moving all of this was done by men who were not citizens. At the outbreak of the war, there were perhaps 25,000 adult male foreigners resident in Attica. One estimate, among several, and the ancient evidence is thin, which would make them something like a third of the free adult men in the country. They were not visitors. Most had been here for years, many had been born here, and some families were on their third generation. Their position was defined precisely. You registered in a dem, which is to say a local district, and you named a citizen as your sponsor, formally answerable for you. You paid a tax for being present. 12 drachmas a year for a man, 6 for a woman running her own household. 12 drachmas is 12 days of a skilled man's wages, or the better part of a month of an unskilled man's, and it bought nothing except the right to remain. Both of those requirements had the same penalty attached. A resident foreigner who failed to pay the tax, or who was found to have no sponsor, could be prosecuted, and if the case succeeded, he was sold into slavery. Not fined, not deported, sold. What the money did not buy was extensive. A metic could not own land or a house in Attica without a specific grant from the assembly, which was rare and was treated as a considerable honor. He could not vote, hold any office, sit on a jury, or stand up on the pnyx and speak. After the citizenship law of 20 years earlier, he could not father children who counted as Athenians, whoever their mother was. What it did require was also extensive. Metics served in the army as heavy infantry alongside citizens, and rode in the fleet, and paid the emergency war levy when it was raised. A wealthy one could be required to fund a chorus for the dramatic competitions. At the winter festival, that is, and not at the great spring one, a distinction with no purpose except to mark the line. And once a year, the line was walked in public. At the city's largest festival, the procession that goes up to the Acropolis includes the resident foreigners, and their part in it is specified. The men carry trays of offerings, and their daughters carry water jars, and walk behind the citizen girls holding parasols over them. Present, essential in the procession, and carrying somebody else's shade. Registration with the authorities, a fee for the privilege of being present, a citizen formally answerable for your conduct, complete participation in the economy, and none whatsoever in the government. Every element of that arrangement is in operation somewhere in the world tonight, mostly under the same justifications, and the resemblance is close enough that it would be dishonest not to say so. What has no modern parallel is the last part. In almost every system now, there is a door at the end of the corridor, however narrow it is, and however long the queue. Athens had no door. There was no length of residence, no amount of tax, no record of service, no quantity of money that led anywhere. You could be here for 60 years, and your grandchildren would be exactly as foreign as you were. The assumption that this made metics an underclass is wrong, and getting it wrong obscures what was actually strange about the arrangement. Plenty of them were richer than most citizens. The exclusion was not economic, and it was not about poverty. It was constitutional, and a man could own the largest workshop in the port, pay for the city's entertainment, march in its infantry, and still have no more say in whether it went to war than a child. The pamphleteer we met earlier, who resented not being allowed to strike them, also explained with some irritation why the city put up with them, because the fleet could not be manned and the workshops could not be run without them, and everybody knew it. The clearest case of all of this lived down here in the port. Cephalus came from Syracuse, and according to his own son, he was persuaded to move to Athens by Pericles. He set up as a manufacturer of shields, a good trade in a city at war, and made a great deal of money at it, and raised his sons here. His house in the Piraeus was well enough known that when Plato, decades later, wanted a setting for the most famous conversation in Western philosophy, he set it there with the old man himself in the opening scene, and did not bother to explain to his readers who he was. One of those sons was Lysias, and Lysias became the finest writer of courtroom speeches in Athens. Men queued to buy his work, learn it by heart, and stand up and deliver it as their own. And it was so good that the professional problem he had to solve was making his speeches sound less accomplished than they were, so that ordinary defendants could plausibly have written them. He supplied the words that Athenians used to save their own lives in front of juries of 500. He was never once permitted to address a court on his own account, or the assembly on any account at all. And in 404, 26 years after this summer, when the democracy had fallen and a junta was in power and looking for money, they came for the family. His brother was arrested and killed. The workshop was stripped, the household goods carried off, the people who worked there taken. Lysias got out through a back door and escaped by sea, and later wrote the whole night down, in the first person, in the plainest prose he ever produced. He had spent his life writing speeches for citizens who could stand up. When it was his own family, he wrote it and had it delivered by somebody else. Behind him on the quay that summer are the sacks. They come off the ships all through the sailing season and go up the walled road on carts because the land at the back of the city cannot feed the people standing on it, and everybody in Piraeus knows it, and so does everybody in Sparta. The land those sacks are replacing begins about half an hour's walk beyond the wall, and the first honest thing to say about it is that it is not good land. Attica is limestone with a thin skin of soil over it, and the rain comes in winter and then stops. What grows here grows because it can tolerate a long, dry summer and a shallow root run, which rules out most of the things a farmer would rather be growing. Barley does well enough, which is why barley and not wheat is what most people actually eat. Beyond that, it is olives, vines, figs, some pulses, and goats, which will eat anything and are the reason the hillsides look the way they do. You can drive through it now in under an hour, and a surprising amount of it still looks like this. The terraces are still cut into the slopes. There are olive groves in the same places, on the same contours, because there is nowhere else for them to be. The year runs on the rain. The first serious downpour of autumn softens the ground enough to break, and everything that has been waiting for it happens at once. Ploughing with a light scratch plough behind an ox or a pair of mules, then sowing the barley by hand. Winter is pruning and the olive harvest, which is done by hand and with poles and takes weeks. Spring is weeding and watching. The grapes come in around September and go straight to the press. Threshing happens on a circular floor of beaten earth in the middle of summer, when there is wind to carry the chaff, and it is the hottest work in the calendar. The olives are the long game. A young tree takes years to come into any kind of production, and decades to reach its full yield, and then it goes on and on. An olive that is a century old is not remarkable, and one that is several centuries old is not unheard of, which means that nobody plants an olive for themselves. You put it in the ground on behalf of people you will not meet, the arithmetic works out, and every farmer who has ever done it has known exactly what he was doing. The people out here are organized into demes, and the dem is the foundation of everything. There are around 140 of them across Attica, from villages of a few dozen families up to substantial towns, and every Athenian belongs to one. Crucially, he belongs to it by descent rather than by address. A family that moved into the city 3 generations ago is still registered out in the countryside, and when a boy reaches 18, it is his father's deme that meets, examines him, and votes on whether he is who he claims to be. The rural district is therefore the gate through which Athenian citizenship is granted, and a great many men who had never farmed anything in their lives were, on paper, from somewhere with a threshing floor. Most of the farms are small, a few acres, worked by the household with a slave or two if the family can run to it. This is not a country of great estates. It is a country of smallholders, which is also why it can field the army it fields, since the men who can afford armor are broadly the men who own enough land to be worth defending. There is a category of tree out here that the state itself protects. Certain olives understood as belonging to Athena were registered and could not be touched. Inspectors went out and checked on them. Uprooting one or removing even a dead stump from the ground where one had stood was an offence tried by the ancient court on the hill of Ares, and the penalty was exile and the loss of everything you owned. A courtroom speech survives from a generation after our summer in which a landowner defends himself against precisely this charge, and the tone of it is the tone of a man in serious trouble. That law was still on the books in the summer of 430, while a Spartan army worked its way across the countryside, cutting things down. They came in every year the war allowed, because that is when armies moved. After the grain was up, and before the autumn rains, when a large body of men could live off the country. The first year they came, they stayed a matter of weeks. This year they came back and stayed something close to 40 days, which was the longest visit of the entire war, and they worked south and east across the plain in stages. What ravaging actually consists of is less dramatic than the word suggests, and a great deal more laborious. Standing grain can be cut or fired if it is standing and if it is dry enough. Vines can be cut down, though they come back. Farm buildings can be pulled apart, presses smashed, storage jars broken, wells fouled. Livestock can be driven off, except that the Athenians had shipped theirs to the islands. And olive trees can be attacked, which is where the reality separates from the rhetoric, because an olive is one of the hardest plants in the world to kill. Burn the top, and it throws up suckers from the root. Cut it down, and it does the same. To finish one properly, you have to get the whole root system out of stony ground with hand tools, and an army of 30 or 40,000 men with a campaigning season to keep, and no interest in agricultural labour is not going to do that across 100 square miles. So the honest position on the damage is that we do not know how bad it was. And there are good reasons to think the traditional picture is overdrawn. We know the army came. We know how long it stayed. We know the route in broad terms, and we know what the Athenians said about it afterwards, which was that the country had been devastated. What we do not have is any way of measuring the difference between a landscape that has been thoroughly wrecked and one that has been frightened. Modern historians who have gone through the practicalities have generally concluded that the economic effect was far smaller than the accounts imply, and that the real weapon was the sight of it. The sight of it very nearly worked. Thucydides describes the second year at Asharnae, a large dam in the plain north of the city with several thousand fighting men of its own, where the Spartan king set up camp and waited, not because Acharnae was strategically decisive, but because he wanted the Acharnians to come out. From the walls, they could see their own fields being cut about, and Thucydides says the young men in particular wanted to march, and that the city was full of arguments and knots of angry people, and that soothsayers were reciting oracles at anybody who would stand still. And Pericles refused to summon the assembly, not lost a vote in it, declined to call one at all on the reasoning that men in that state of mind would decide something disastrous, and that the safest thing was to give them nowhere to decide it. The most participatory constitution in the ancient world, and the man running the war simply did not convene it while the country was on fire because he did not trust what it would say. The countryside had one other thing in it, and it was the thing that paid for all of the above. 35 miles southeast of the city, in the dry hills at the bottom of Attica, is Lorien, and under Lorien is silver. It occurs in a lead ore that runs in seams through the limestone, and getting it out is among the most unpleasant work anybody did anywhere in the Greek world. Shafts were sunk from the surface. Some of them go down more than 100 meters, cut square with footholds in the walls, and from the bottom, galleries were driven out along the seam. In places, those galleries are under a meter high. The work is done lying down or crouched, with a hammer and a pick, in air that does not move. The ore came up, was crushed, and was washed on stone tables in a district with almost no water, which the Athenians solved by cutting cisterns to catch the winter rain and running the same water round a closed circuit until it was exhausted. Then the concentrate was smelted for lead, and the lead was worked in a hearth with air blown across the surface until the silver was left behind. The mines belonged to the state, which leased them out. The labor was enslaved, and it was rented. Xenophon records that a man named Nicias, one of the wealthiest citizens in Athens and a general, owned 1,000 men in the mines and hired them out to a Thracian contractor at 1 obol per man per day. Others named alongside him held 600 and 300. 1,000 obols a day is 167 drachmas. Across a year, that is around 60,000 drachmas, which is to say the equivalent of the entire annual earnings of some 160 free-skilled craftsmen arriving in one household for doing nothing except owning people and handing them to somebody else. Estimates for the whole district at its peak run to 20,000 workers. Everything this city counted in came out of those galleries. The 2 obols a juror took home. The drachma a day on the Acropolis scaffolding, paid identically to citizen, foreigner, and slave. The 72 drachmas that a Carian child fetched at public auction, the 3.5 obols for 4 painted pots, the tribute stacked on the rock, the wages of the fleet, the fine imposed on Pericles this summer. All of it was mined by men working on their sides in the dark, and then stamped with an owl. Down there, the hour is not a thing anybody can see. What the galleries have, cut into the wall at intervals, are small niches for a lamp. And a lamp holds about 4 hours of oil. First light on a street on the north side of the city, and a man in his 50s is waiting by a door for a boy of 9 to come out. He is carrying the boy's things: a pair of hinged wooden tablets, a stylus, a small lyre in a cloth, a round flask of oil with a curved bronze scraper tied to it, and a leather ball. He will carry them there and carry them back. He will sit through the lessons. He is the boy's constant companion from the moment he can walk to the edge of manhood, and his job description, insofar as anybody wrote one down, is manners. He is teaching the boy to walk through the streets with his eyes down, and his cloak arranged properly rather than gathered up in his fist. To stand when an older man comes in. Not to cross his legs when seated. Not to reach across the table and take the good piece. To keep his voice low and to be able to sit still, and to go where he is going without stopping to watch things. He is also enslaved. Usually an older man, often one no longer strong enough for heavy work, which is frequently why the household put him in the job. And under the arrangement his owner has set up, he may beat the boy, which produces the following situation in the same city, in the same years. The men who would grow up to stand on a hillside and vote on whether an enslaved witness should be tortured before his evidence could be heard were taught how to conduct themselves in public by an enslaved man who was authorized to hit them when they got it wrong, and who is not named anywhere in the record. What Athenian gentlemen understood as good manners and prized in each other and used to identify their own kind on sight was installed by people they owned. The schools themselves were nobody's responsibility. There was no public system, no compulsion, and no free provision. A father who could afford it paid from about the age of 6 or 7, and a father who could not, did not, and there were a great many of the second sort. 3 men taught, and they were separate businesses in separate premises. The first taught letters, the alphabet, then syllables, then reading, then writing, and after that a great deal of memorizing. The second taught the lyre, which meant playing it, singing to it, and learning the lyric poets. The third took the boys to the wrestling ground and taught them to run, jump, throw, and fight. What is absent from that list is nearly everything. There is no arithmetic beyond what a shopkeeper needs, no history as a subject, no geography, no natural science, no philosophy. The core of an Athenian boy's education, the part that took the most hours and mattered most to his father, was poetry and the body. He came out of it able to read, able to hold a tune, physically hard, and carrying an enormous quantity of Homer in his head. That last part is not a figure of speech. Boys learned poetry by heart in volume, hundreds of lines, sometimes very much more, and Athenian adults could and did quote it at each other in ordinary conversation, in the courts and on the assembly hill, and expected to be understood. Anyone who was made to learn something by heart at 8 knows exactly what that does. It is still there. The verses, the times tables, the prayer, the poem you were marched through in front of the class and hated. Decades later, unbidden, in full, while the useful things you learned at 30 have gone completely. The Athenians simply built an entire education on that property of the human head and used it deliberately, and the result was a population that shared a vocabulary of stories in a way that is hard for us to picture now. The physical equipment of all this comes up out of the ground in quantity. The excavations of the old market square and the houses around it have produced styluses in bronze and bone, pointed at one end for cutting into the wax, and flattened at the other for smoothing a mistake away. A writing tool with the correction built into the far end of it. Fragments of the tablets themselves, hinged in pairs so the wax faces close on each other. And everywhere broken pottery used as scrap, because a boy practicing letters does not need anything better. And the city had an inexhaustible supply. Toys turn up too. Terracotta rattles, spinning tops, small carts on wheels, knuckle bones by the handful, and jointed dolls with arms and legs that move, which are recognizable across the whole gap without any explanation at all. The wrestling ground was where the other half of the education happened. Boys exercised naked, oiled first and scraped down afterwards, on sand that was raked and watered. They ran, they wrestled, they boxed, they threw. Physical training was not a supplement to a boy's education. For a great many families, it was the education, and a father who could only afford one master usually chose this one. It was also, as we have already seen, the place where grown men came to watch and to make their approaches, and the presence of the older slave sitting at the edge with the oil flask was not decorative. Athens had 3 great exercise grounds outside the walls, and the third one is the interesting one. 2 of them served citizen boys. The third was for boys of mixed descent, the sons of an Athenian father and a foreign mother, who, after the citizenship law, were not Athenians and never would be. They had their own field on the other side of the city, and everybody knew which one it was. Boyhood ended at 18 with the Dem examination, and then the young men went out to the frontier forts for a spell of patrol duty on the borders of Attica. The famous 2-year training program with its oath and its uniform belongs to a later century and does not exist yet. What exists in 430 is something looser and more improvised, which mostly involves walking about the hills in the cold, looking for people who should not be there. None of this applied to girls who did not go to school at all. A girl was taught at home by her mother and the household women, and what she was taught was the work: spinning, weaving, cooking, storing, managing the people under her, running the accounts of a house. Whether she learned to read is not clear. Some women plainly did. There are vase paintings of women holding book rolls, and there are letters, but the sample is small, skewed towards the wealthy, and the images may be showing an ideal rather than a fact. What is not in doubt is that her education was vocational, and that the job started at about 14. With one exception, which happened every year on the Acropolis, and which nobody has ever fully explained. 2 girls, somewhere between 7 and 11 years old, were chosen from prominent families to live up on the rock for a year in the service of Athena. They had a house near the north wall, and beside it a place where they played ball, which the traveller Pausanias saw and mentioned when he came through centuries later. Their formal duty concerned the great robe that was woven for the goddess. At a festival in late autumn, the loom was set up, and the priestess and these 2 children began it, putting in the first threads of a garment that would take months and be carried up to the goddess by the whole city. At the end of their year came the other thing. The priestess of Athena gave the 2 of them something to carry, covered, and they put it on their heads. Then they left the top of the rock by a way that went down inside it. There is a cleft in the north face with a cut stairway in it, found in the 1930s, and it is generally taken to be the route. And at the bottom, in the dark, they set down what they were carrying and took up something else, also covered, and brought that back up. Then their year was over, and 2 more girls were chosen. Pausanias set the rite down in writing and added the detail that makes it impossible to forget. Neither the girls carrying the baskets nor the priestess handing them over knew what was inside. This is a city that cut its building accounts into marble so that any citizen could check the sums. It published the auction price of a Carian child on a public stone. It kept written lists of its own dead. And every year it sent 2 small girls down a stairway inside a rock at night with something in a covered basket. And for as long as anybody was doing it, nobody wrote down what it was. There is no word in Greek for religion, not a missing word that they used something else for. There is no category. Greek has words for the gods, for rites, for what is sacred, for the obligations a person owes. But nothing that fences all of that off into a separate department of life the way our word does, because it was not a separate department. It was the medium everything else happened in. There is also no scripture, no creed, no conversion, no congregation, and no requirement whatsoever to believe anything in particular. Nobody was ever asked what they thought about the gods as a condition of taking part. What was asked was whether they did the right things, at the right times, in the right order, with the right words. And if they did, it worked, and their private opinions were their own business. The Athenian word that comes closest to piety means something much more like paying what you owe. And there is no clergy. A priesthood was an office, not a vocation, and not a caste. Some were held for a year, some for life. Some belonged hereditarily to particular old families, and a great many were filled by lot in exactly the way the council was. A priest of a major god was a citizen with a job, who had a household and a trade and an opinion about the war, and who went back to all of that when his term ended. Which also means that a significant number of these offices were held by women. And the priestess of Athena, up on the rock, was among the most visible public figures in the city, in a place that otherwise kept women out of public life altogether. At street level, it looks like this. On the corner where 2 roads meet, and at the doorway of most houses, there is a squared stone pillar about the height of a man, with a bearded head carved at the top and an erect phallus on the front. That is a herm, and there are hundreds of them in Athens. They are not statues in a sanctuary. They are furniture of the street, standing in the open where people walk past them, get garlanded at festivals, and are touched for luck. To a modern eye, they are startling. To an Athenian, they were as ordinary as a postbox, and they were there to keep bad things out of the doorway. Inside the house, the fire on the hearth is the household's own god, and there is at least one more. In the storeroom, where the oil and the grain and the family's property is kept, there stands a small jar with wool tied round its handles, filled with water and oil and mixed fruit. That is Zeus of the storeroom, who looks after what a household has managed to accumulate. Not an image of him. The jar is the arrangement. And at the crossroads at the new moon, families left out food for Hecate, a plate of something, set down where the roads met. It was well understood in Athens that the poor came and ate it. Comedians made jokes about it. Nobody appears to have regarded this as a problem, or as a scandal, or even as ironic. The food was put out, and it was gone by morning. And both of those things were true at once. The year itself was religious. 12 lunar months, most of them named after the festival that fell in them, with an extra month shoved in every few years to stop the calendar drifting away from the seasons. Something in the region of 120 days had a festival on them at some level, from small local observances up to the enormous state occasions, and the state paid. Which is why the sacrifices mattered so much to poor households, since the god took the fat and the bones, and the citizens took the meat. At the greatest of the festivals, the prize for winning the games was a very large jar of olive oil, pressed from the trees that belonged to the goddess, and the jars were painted in the black figure technique that had gone out of fashion generations earlier, because that was how it had always been done. The one to walk through properly is a 3-day festival in late winter, when the wine made in the autumn is finally ready. On the first day, the jars are broached. The new wine is brought to the sanctuary of Dionysus, opened, mixed, and tasted, and the household slaves drink alongside everybody else, which on this occasion is the rule rather than an indulgence. The second day is the one that gives the festival its shape, and it is the strangest day in the Athenian year. Every adult is given a jug of his own, holding something like 3 liters. Nobody shares a mixing bowl. At a signal from a trumpet, everybody drinks. In silence, each from his own vessel, not speaking, not passing anything, not toasting. There is a prize for finishing first. The story Athenians told about why they did this involved Orestes arriving in the city with his mother's blood on him, at a moment when the king could neither turn away a suppliant nor let him share a table with clean men. The compromise was that everyone drank separately and nobody spoke. Underneath the story sits the real reason, which is that this was a polluted day. The temples were roped off. Doors were smeared with pitch. People chewed buckthorn against what was abroad. The dead were understood to be walking around the city, and the ordinary courtesies of sharing a cup were not safe. And on that same day, children who had reached the age of 3 were crowned with the first flowers of the year and given their own small jug, a miniature of the adult one, a few inches high, painted with things a small child would recognize. Toddlers crawling, a boy pulling a cart on a string, a dog, a ball. Hundreds of those little jugs have come out of Athenian graves. They are found with children who did not reach their 3rd anthesteria, buried with the jug they would have been given, decorated with the games they did not get to. The excavation reports list them by height and by find spot. There is nothing to add to that. The 3rd day belongs to the dead outright. A pot of grain and seeds is boiled and set out for them, and no living person eats any of it. And at the end of the day, the household says the formula that closes the festival and sends the visitors home. Out, spirits, the anthisteria is over. Then the doors are unsealed and the ordinary year resumes. One thing this city did not have was a religion you went inside. A Greek temple is not a church and was never used as one. It houses the statue and, in the Athenian case, a great deal of public money. And it is essentially a very expensive box seen from the outside. The altar stands in the open air in front of it, and that is where everything happens. The procession, the killing, the smoke, the crowd. There is no congregation sitting in rows. There is no building designed to hold one, except at Eleusis, 14 miles west along the coast road, where there is exactly that. The requirements for admission to the mysteries were two. You had to speak Greek, and you had to be free of blood guilt. That was all of them. Women were initiated, foreigners were initiated, enslaved people were initiated, and there is no evidence that anybody thought this remarkable. Every line this account has spent 12 chapters describing: citizen and metic, free and owned, male and female, stopped at that door. Each autumn, the initiates walked out of Athens along the sacred way in a procession that took most of a day, several thousand strong, and part of the way ran over a bridge where, by custom, people shouted abuse at them as they passed. There had been days of preparation before it, a fast, a washing in the sea, a sacrifice. At the end of the road, they drank a mixture of barley and water flavoured with pennyroyal, and at night, they went into the hall. The hall is the anomaly. It is a great square-roofed building with tiered seating running round all four of its inner walls, and a small enclosed structure standing in the middle. And it was rebuilt bigger, repeatedly, across centuries because more people kept coming. Thousands could sit in it at once. Nothing else in Greek religion is built to do that. If you had been in there at the end of the night, standing on the steps with several thousand people in the dark, you would know what happened next. Nobody else does. That is the honest position, and it is worth setting out precisely because the gap is unusually clean. We know where the building was, and we have excavated it. We know the route, the dates, the fees, the officials and their titles, the 2 grades of initiation, and roughly how many people it held. We know a great fire burned and that light was involved somehow, and that something was shown. We do not know what was shown, or what was said, or what was done. The suggestions on offer, a sacred object displayed, a drama performed, a drug in the drink, are guesses, and the people making them say so. Writers who had been initiated do mention it, and what they say is consistent and useless, that it was the best thing in their lives, that people came out of it less afraid of dying, and then they stop in mid-paragraph and change the subject. The penalty for revealing it was death, and there were prosecutions. But penalties are the weakest explanation available here because this went on for something close to 1,000 years, and the people who could have talked ran into the hundreds of thousands, and they included the poor, the enslaved, the drunk, the resentful, and the very old, in a culture that wrote down its shopping lists. The likelier reason is much plainer. They had all been the person who did not yet know. And having stood in the dark at the top of that road and found whatever it was they found, not one of them was willing to take it away from the next person who walked out from the city. That is not an exotic motive, and it has not gone anywhere. It is the same thing that stops us telling somebody how the book ends. For the first 5 days of its life, a child born in Athens is not yet a member of the household it was born into. It is there, it is fed, it is looked after. What has not happened is the act that makes it part of the family, and until that act happens, the child has no name, no standing, and no formal existence at all. The house is in a state of pollution from the birth, and has to stay that way until the business is completed. On the 5th day, or in some households the 7th, the family gathers indoors and the child is carried at a run around the hearth. The same fire that stands at the middle of every Athenian house, where the household's own gods are understood to live, and around which a bride was walked when she arrived. Everyone who assisted at the birth washes, the house is purified, and the child, having been carried round the fire, is in the family. Then the presents arrive, and they are the same presents every time. Friends and relatives send octopus and cuttlefish. Nobody has satisfactorily explained why, and the Athenians appear not to have wondered about it either. It was simply what you sent. The door of the house is marked so that anyone passing knows what has happened inside. An olive branch means a boy. A tuft of raw wool means a girl. Households that could afford it held a second occasion on the 10th day, a proper feast with guests and a sacrifice, at which the child was formally named in front of witnesses. Poorer families did the naming at the first ceremony and left it there. Later, at the autumn Kiln festival, a boy would be presented to his father's wider clan and accepted by them, and, later still, at 18, the Dem would meet and vote on whether he was who he said he was. Belonging in this city arrived in stages, and each stage had a room full of people in it. The reason for the delay is recorded, and it is best left exactly as the sources put it. The rite was not performed sooner because most children who died within the first week. And so it was held back until after the 7th day, in order that there might be at least some probability of the child remaining alive. That sentence is the whole of Athenian infancy, and there is very little to be added to it. The impulse behind it has not gone anywhere. Most families in the world still keep a pregnancy quiet through the early months, and the reasoning offered is practical, and the actual reason underneath is that saying a thing out loud makes it a thing you have to unsay. The Athenians had simply worked out where the line fell in their own circumstances and built a ceremony on it. What happened before the 5th day took place in a room with no men in it. Birth was managed by women. A midwife if one could be got, and otherwise the experienced women of the household and the neighborhood. The mother was seated rather than lying down on a stool or a chair or supported by others, which is a better position for the work and was universal across the ancient Mediterranean. There were herbs and there were amulets and there were prayers to Artemis, who had charge of exactly this. How many women died is a question with no answer. The ancient world did not count, and the modern estimates are extrapolations from other pre-modern societies, and anybody who gives a firm figure is giving you a model rather than a fact. What does survive is a sanctuary of Artemis on the east coast of Attica, at Brauron, where women dedicated clothing to the goddess, and where the priests kept written inventories of what had been given. Those inventories are on stone and you can read them. They list garments one by one in the flat register of an audit. The type, the colour, the pattern, the state of it. A spotted robe, a saffron one, children's clothing. The lists run to hundreds of items, and they were compiled by officials making sure nothing went missing from the treasury. And they are among the very few documents in which large numbers of Athenian women appear as people who owned things and chose to give them away. Some of what was there had belonged to women who survived a birth. Some of it, according to one contemporary poet, had belonged to women who did not. There is a decision in all of this that has to be stated plainly rather than skirted. Between the birth and the ceremony at the hearth, a newborn could be refused. The father made that decision, and a child not taken up was put out. How often this actually happened is genuinely unclear, and the argument among historians is unresolved. The practice is referred to in comedy and in later moralizing writers as a thing everybody knew about, which is not the same as evidence that it was common. The demographic data that might settle it does not exist. What can be said is that the mechanism existed, that it operated in that window before the child was admitted to the family, and that the timing of the ceremony and the timing of the decision are the same fact seen from two directions. Alongside all of this, in these decades, a group of men were writing something new down. The medical texts that come out of this period include collections of individual case notes, around 40 of them in one group, recording particular patients day by day. They are not stories, and they were not written to be read for pleasure. Each begins with a person and an address, the wife of a man named Epicrates, who lived by the temple of Artemis, a man called Silenus, who lived on the broad way near a named neighbor's house. Then the log. What day the fever started, whether he slept, what he passed, whether he talked sense, what day the crisis came and what happened on it. The outcome is entered in the same register as everything else. On the 11th day, he died. Then the writer moves to the next patient and starts again. An honest note belongs here. Most of these people were not Athenians. The case notes come largely from towns in the north, Thasos, Abdera, places in Thessaly, and although this is the same medical world in the same decades, it is not this city. What they give us is the manner of thought rather than an Athenian street. And the manner of thought is startling. One treatise from this tradition takes on epilepsy, which everybody called the sacred disease, and opens by stating that it is no more divine than any other illness, that it has a nature and a cause like everything else, and that people call things divine when they do not understand them and want to look as though they do. That was written in a city where a jar in the storeroom was a god, where the assembly ground was purified with the blood of piglets before business, and where nobody thought any of this contradictory. Athens did not even have a healing god of its own yet. The cult arrived from over the water about a decade after our summer, which leaves the question of what to make of a family that would not say a child's name for 5 days. And the easy answer is the wrong one. The easy answer is that they held back because they expected to lose the child and did not want to be too attached. It is a tidy explanation, and everything else in the record contradicts it. These are people who buried infants with rattles and jointed dolls and small painted jugs, who put up carved gravestones for 2-year-olds, whose doctors sat by a child for 11 days, writing down what happened each morning, in the same hand and the same detail they gave a grown man, which is not what anybody does about something they consider replaceable. The delay was never about feeling, it was about the act. Naming was not a label attached to a person, it was an admission, performed in front of witnesses, with the fire and the household gods in the room. What a family withheld for 5 days was the ceremony, not the child. And on the 5th day, or the 7th, they carried it round the fire and the door got its olive branch or its wool, and somebody in that room said the name out loud for the first time in front of everyone, so that it counted. There is a block of marble in the Louvre, and one face of it is covered in Greek from edge to edge. It is a peculiar object to stand in front of, even for somebody who cannot read a word of Greek, because the writing is so evidently a list. The lines are short, and they stop at the same place. The letters are the same size all the way down. Whatever this is, it is not an argument or a decree or a dedication. It is an inventory of something cut with great care by somebody who was paid to be accurate. At the top, there is a heading, and the heading says, "Of Erectais, these died in the war, in Cyprus, in Egypt, in Phoenicia, at Haliais, in Aegina, at Megara, in the same year." Erechteus is one of the 10 tribes into which the Athenian citizen body was divided. So this is 1/10 of the city. Those 6 places are 6 separate theatres of war, 2 of them at the far end of the Mediterranean and 3 of them close enough to walk to. And the last 3 words of the heading are doing an enormous amount of work. Then the names begin. There are something over 130 of them. That is all there is. No father's name, no dem, no rank, no age, no unit, no indication of how any of them died or which of the 6 wars took them. In ordinary Athenian life, a man's full identity is 3 parts: his own name, his father's name, and the district his family belongs to. And it is how he is registered, how he is addressed in a courtroom, and how he is distinguished from the other 4 men in his dem called the same thing. On this stone, 2/3 of that has been deleted on purpose. The monument was cut about 30 years before our summer, and it survives better than most, which is why it is the one in the case. But the ritual it belongs to was annual and unbroken, and Athens produced one of these every year that it lost men, including the year that has just ended. There is 1 seam in it, and it is worth keeping rather than smoothing over. The equality is not quite total. 4 archers are marked out separately on the stone, and 1 man, Telenikos, has a word beside his name identifying him as a seer. The likeliest explanation is not honorific but administrative. Archers were a different kind of soldier from the heavy infantry, often drawn from outside the citizen body, and a seer travelling with an army was an attached specialist rather than a man in the line. Somebody keeping the register needed those 5 accounted for differently, and did it, and thereby produced the only individuals on the whole monument about whom we know a single additional fact. It works the way this always works. 130 men reduced to nothing but names, and then one of them turns out to have read the entrails before battles. And out of the 130, he is the one you will still be thinking about in an hour. The Athenians did not intend that and could not have prevented it. The men on lists like this one mostly died in a formation whose entire logic is that nobody steps out of it. The Athenian heavy infantryman carries a round shield about 3 feet across, wood-faced with bronze, gripped by an armband at the elbow and a handle at the rim, which means it hangs on the left arm and covers the left half of his own body and the right half of the man beside him. His own right side is covered by the shield of the man to his right. A phalanx works if, and only if, every man holds his place, because everybody in it is being protected by somebody else. The formations closed, pushed, and one side broke, and most of the killing happened afterwards during the running away. Battles were short. The winners generally lost few men, and the losers lost a great many, and both sides went home to get the harvest in. The other half of the war did not happen on land at all, and it belonged to different people. Rowing a warship required no armour and no property, which meant it was open to the men who had neither, the poorest citizens, alongside resident foreigners and hired hands from anywhere in the Aegean. Athens was strong because of its fleet, and its fleet floated on the labour of the men with least to lose, and everybody in the city understood the political arithmetic that followed from that. The radical shape of the democracy and the shape of the navy are the same fact. The ships themselves are extraordinary and almost uninhabitable. A trireme is a long, light, thin shell with 3 banks of oars, the lowest of them just above the waterline behind a leather sleeve. And there is nowhere on board to sleep and no capacity to carry water or food for any length of time. They could not stay out. Every evening they had to find a beach, land, and let 200 men cook and sleep on the sand, which is what an empire of harbours is actually for. When the dead came home, the city did the same thing with them every year, and Thucydides set out the procedure. 3 days before the funeral, the bones were laid out in a and anyone who wished came and brought offerings to their own. Then 10 coffins of cypress wood were carried out on wagons, one for each tribe, with each man's bones in the coffin of his own tribe. And one more bier went with them, empty, made up as if it were occupied. That one was for the men whose bodies had not been found. The procession went out through the northwest gate, the same road that carries carts and donkeys and country people into the city every morning, and turned along the way to the academy where the public burial ground was. Anyone could walk in it, citizen or foreigner, and the women of the families were there at the graveside, which, in a city that kept women out of nearly every public occasion, is not a small thing. Then the coffins went into the earth, and a man chosen by the city for his standing and his judgment came forward and spoke. In the winter that had just passed, that man was Pericles. The speech he gave over the first year's dead is the most quoted piece of political prose to survive from the ancient world. And there is a caveat about it that has to come first, because Thucydides himself supplies it. He states openly, early in his book, that he could not recall the exact words of the speeches he reports, and that what he has done is set down what seemed to him to be required by each occasion, while staying as close as he could to the general sense of what was actually said. So the most famous speech in Greek is, by its author's own account, a reconstruction. What it argues is unusual for the genre. The customary funeral speech ran through the ancestors and their victories. This one spends its length on the character of the city instead. On the claim that Athens was worth dying for, not because of what it had taken, but because of the way its people lived, in the open, tolerantly, without envying a neighbour's private habits, and with an expectation that ordinary men would take a hand in public matters, and would think the man who did not was useless rather than merely quiet. And near the end, it says something about memory, that the whole earth is the grave of famous men, and that what is written on a column at home is the smaller part of it, the larger being an unwritten record, carried in the minds of people far away. He said all of that in the winter, standing at the edge of a trench outside the northwest gate, with 10 coffins and 1 empty bier in front of him. We build these again now, and it is worth being precise about the word again. For most of the 2,500 years in between, the way to mark a war was an arch or a column, or a bronze man on a bronze horse, with a sentence underneath about glory and a sculpted figure representing victory. The list came back late, within living memory, after every other idea had been tried and found to be about the wrong thing. Names in order at the same size, cut into a wall people walk along and touch. No rank, no unit. No explanation offered and none attempted. Nobody was copying Athens. It was arrived at independently by people working on the same problem, and they landed on the same answer. That when there are too many dead to say anything true about, the only thing that does not insult them is their names, all the same size, with nothing in front of them, which is what is on that block of marble in the Louvre, and why people who cannot read a word of it stand there longer than they meant to. 4 months after the funeral, at the start of the sailing season, a ship came into the harbour at Piraeus. Nobody recorded which one or where from or what it was carrying, because at the time there was nothing to record. The port did what it always did. The samples went up onto the tables, the grain went onto the carts, the crews found somewhere to eat. Something had come in with them, and according to the man who wrote it down, it had begun a long way off, beyond Egypt, he says, and it worked its way down through Egypt and Libya before it reached the Greek world. It arrived in Attica through the harbour, and the people living in Piraeus had it first, and there was a story going round afterwards that the Spartans had poisoned the wells, which Thucydides records, and does not believe. Before anything else about it, one fact is worth putting down and leaving in place. It stayed for about 2 years, faded, came back for a shorter second visit 3 or 4 years after that, and then it stopped. Nothing in the 24 centuries since has ever been securely matched to it. Whatever it was, it has not been identified in any later outbreak anywhere in the world. The long argument about what it was is an argument about something that is no longer in existence, conducted by people in well-lit rooms over a very great distance. The man doing the writing had it himself. Thucydides caught it, recovered, and went on living in the city while it ran, and he is unusually explicit about why he set the thing down in the detail he did. He says he will leave the question of causes to other people, and that speculation about where it came from is not his business. What he intends to do is describe what it actually looked like, in enough detail that if it ever appeared again, anybody who had read him would recognize it. What he produced is the first sustained clinical description in European literature, written by a man with no medical training whatsoever. It is organized the way a careful person would organize it if nobody had ever shown him how, starting at the head and working downwards through the body, in order, noting what happened on which day. 2 things about it are worth having. The doctors died first and in the greatest numbers, because they went closest, and because at the beginning they had no idea what they were dealing with. And once it became clear that recovery brought protection, that the same person was not taken twice, at least not fatally, the people who had already had it became the ones who could nurse the sick without fear. And Thucydides says they did, and that they were the gentlest with the dying, because they knew. There is no need to reproduce the symptoms here, and one detail from the passage does more work than the whole list would. The scavengers would not touch the bodies. Birds and animals that feed on human remains either kept away from the dead, of whom there were many lying unburied, or ate and then died themselves. Thucydides notes that the birds of prey simply became scarce, and that the effect was easiest to observe in dogs, because dogs live in the house with people. There is a particular kind of person who, in the middle of something they cannot control, starts taking notes. Not for a purpose they could name at the time, and not because it helps. It is a specific and recognizable way of being frightened. And the notes tend to be unusually good, and this is by some distance the most famous example of it. What the notes cannot do is tell us what it was, and the failure is instructive. Thucydides was precise, but he was precise in his own categories, and the things a 5th century Greek noticed and the things a modern clinician needs are not the same set. Nearly every serious candidate has been proposed at one time or another. Typhus, typhoid, smallpox, measles, a viral hemorrhagic fever, and several others. And each of them accounts for a good deal of the description and then fails on some particular. The animals are a real obstacle. An organism that only lives in people cannot kill the dogs. The protection he describes in survivors fits some candidates, and not others. And the population it hit was crammed into a walled city in high summer with the whole countryside living in improvised shelter, which is a set of conditions that can make almost any disease behave unlike itself. What it did to the city was, in the end, less a matter of numbers than of arrangements. The rites came apart. Thucydides says that the funeral customs which had always been observed were thrown into confusion, and people buried their dead however they could. Families who had lost too many to manage it properly used other people's pyres, arriving at a fire somebody else had built and putting their own dead on it, or laying a body on top of one already burning and walking away. The sanctuaries where the country families were sheltering had bodies in them because people died where they were living. 4 months earlier, the city had carried 10 cypress coffins out through the northwest gate on wagons, one for each tribe, with an empty bier for the men who could not be found. And there is no list from that summer. Thucydides gives figures only for the army, something over 4,000 heavy infantry and 300 cavalry. And he can give those because the army kept rolls. For everybody else, he states flatly that the number could not be established, and it never was. In the mid-1990s, ahead of construction work on a metro station just outside the boundary of the old cemetery on the Northwest Road, archaeologists working for the Greek service opened a shaft. There were about 90 people in it. 10 of them were children. They had been put in without soil between the layers, laid in successive rows at whatever angle they arrived at, in a hole that was clearly not planned for the number it received. The pottery in with them dates the deposit to around 430, and the excavator's estimate is that the mound raised over it may have covered as many as 150. There were grave offerings, not many, far fewer than a burial ground of that period would normally produce, and that shortfall is part of the evidence for what kind of burial this was. But there were some. In the middle of it, with the customs coming apart and the ground running out, somebody was still putting things in. One of the 10 children was a girl of about 11, and her skull came out of that shaft close to complete, jaw, teeth, and the milk teeth still in place. In 2010, a team led by Manolis Papagrigorakis, a professor of orthodontics at the University of Athens working with specialists from Sweden and France, built a face onto a 3-dimensional copy of that skull using the standard forensic method, laying the tissue depths on from the bone outward. She is on display in Athens now, and you can go and stand in front of her. The name she is known by is modern. Somebody had to call her something. 4 years before the reconstruction, a study came out of the same university that had extracted DNA from the dental pulp of 3 teeth taken from the pit, and reported sequences matching the organism that causes typhoid fever. It was published in a medical journal, and it made news everywhere. Within a matter of months, in the same journal, 3 researchers, Beth Shapiro, Andrew Ramboat, and Thomas Gilbert, published a reply arguing that the identification did not hold. The match had been made on similarity scores. When the ancient sequence was placed properly in a family tree, it fell outside typhoid and outside the neighboring species as well, which is not a result that identifies anything. The original team answered them. Since then, the work has continued, and the most recent argument, drawing the historical description and the clinical picture, and the molecular evidence together, comes down in favor of a different member of the same bacterial family altogether. Partly on the grounds that this one can kill animals, and the dogs died. So the honest answer, after 20 years, is that we do not know what killed her. That is 20 years of published argument, carried on in journals by people who have mostly never met. About 3 teeth belonging to one child who was buried in a hurry in a hole outside a city wall in the summer of 430. None of it can tell you what she died of. What it can tell you is that she was about 11, that her teeth were in good condition, and that the question is still open. Which means that somebody, this year, is still asking it. The awnings come down first. They are untied from their poles in the middle of the afternoon, while there is still plenty of light, and the poles are laid flat and the trestles stacked, and whatever is left on the fish tables goes cheap and then goes into the seller's own basket. The noise drops in stages. By the time the shadow of the hill reaches the far side of the square, there is nobody selling anything, and the ground is covered in the sort of debris that a few thousand people leave behind them. String, broken pot, fish scales, straw, and a few dogs are working through it. The workshops finish next. Kilns are banked rather than let out, because getting one up to heat again from cold costs a day. Tools go inside. The wheel stops. Out on the roads into the city, there is a last movement of carts coming in with wood and charcoal before the gates, and men walking home in twos and threes with the low sun in their faces. In the houses, the fires are already going for the evening meal, and the smoke from several thousand of them settles into the streets at about head height and stays there, because the air stops moving at this time of day. Whatever is cooking is not elaborate. Barley, oil, an onion, cheese, whatever came home in the basket, a little wine cut with a good deal of water. The eating is quick, and it is not the event. Along the colonnades on the edges of the open ground, the country families who have been here since the second spring of the war are laying out their bedding again in the same places they laid it out yesterday. They have their corners. Everybody knows whose corner is whose, and the arrangements have been in force long enough now that a stranger arriving would be told where not to put himself. Doors get barred, not against anything dramatic, against the ordinary business of a city with no lighting and nobody patrolling it, and against the ordinary sort of man who has noticed that the wall on the alley side is dry mud and not very thick. And then, in each of those houses, somebody lights the lamp. It is not much light, enough for a room and for the faces in it, and not enough for anybody to do close work by, which is why close work happens in daylight, and why the evening is for talking. A boy is being told something he will still be able to recite when he is 50. Somebody is complaining about a price. In one house in 100, there are couches along the walls and a bowl in the middle of the room, and an argument getting underway that will run past midnight. And in the other 99, the household sits round the fire and then goes to bed, because tomorrow starts when there is light to work by. Outside, the streets go completely black. At the corners and the doorways, the herms stand where they always stand, and nobody can see them, and everybody knows exactly where they are. Above all of it, the rock goes dark, and the great building on it goes dark with everything else. Its red and its blue draining out of it in the last of the light, until it is simply a shape. The city did not end that summer. That should be said plainly. It lost the war eventually, 26 years later, and had its walls pulled down, and its fleet taken away. And then it got most of it back, and went on being one of the most consequential places in the world for centuries afterwards. The evening described here happened somewhere between 15 and 20,000 more times before anything fundamental about it changed. But something did stop, and you can put your hand on the place where it stopped. The great gatehouse at the top of the Acropolis was begun 5 years before our summer, and abandoned when the money went to the war, and it was never finished. Nobody ever came back to it. Greek builders left rough lumps of surplus stone projecting from each block so that ropes and levers could grip them, and dressed those lumps away once the block was in place. And on the gatehouse, a great many of them were never dressed away. The handles are still on the stone. 2,500 years of visitors have walked in through a building that was left with its lifting gear still attached, and most of them have not looked. What did come down to us is nearly all of it accidental. Oil flasks made to be put in the ground and never handled again, now handled, catalogued, photographed and lit in cases in 6 countries. A wine jar carrying one painter's insult to another, sold abroad, buried with somebody who could not read it, and dug up. A block of marble in Paris with 130 names on it, and no fathers. 2 lines on a public pay list, recording that a man called Somenes and a man called Sindron were paid for work on a building, because a clerk had a column to balance. Even the account we have been reading from stops without warning. Thucydides was exiled a few years after this summer, spent 20 years out of the country talking to people on both sides, and wrote steadily. And then the book simply ends. Partway through the events of 411, in the middle of a sentence. With the war, it was about still 8 years from finishing. Nobody knows why. The most careful witness the ancient world produced put down his pen mid-clause and never picked it up. What we hold, sitting with a place like this, is almost entirely what nobody meant to send. They meant to send the temples and the speeches and the monuments, and those tell us truthfully what this city wanted to be, which is worth knowing. But the things that arrived by accident, the receipts, the price scratched under a pot, the payroll line, the inventory of a dead woman's clothes, the little jug in a child's grave, are the ones with the people in them. Nobody set out to preserve Somenes. He is here because arithmetic required his name. That is the arrangement history actually runs on, and it means the past keeps handing us the ordinary by mistake, which turns out to be the part we needed. The oil is going down now. It gets to a point in the evening where the light has visibly dropped and the room has quietly become smaller, and the faces at the far side of it are less distinct than they were an hour ago. Somebody notices. Somebody weighs whether the last of the oil is worth spending and decides that it is not, and leaves the jug where it is. That was the final decision of the day, and it was made in every house in this city, every night, for centuries. The flame sinks into the clay. It goes narrow and blue at the base, and then it goes. The room is dark. The street outside it is dark. The hill above them both is dark. And it has all been dark for a very long time now. There is nothing left in that house that needs anybody. You are somewhere warm, and it is tonight, and none of it is asking anything of you. Sleep well.